Okay, good morning. We're going to call this session of the City of Issaquah Hearing Examiner to order. I'm Ted Hunter, who's the hearing examiner here and decide this appeal. We're here this morning because the group Preserve Providence Heights has appealed the threshold determination of the City of Issaquah made on a proposal to demolish a campus known as the Providence Heights campus. We have present in the room representatives of the appellant, I assume, who will be speaking on behalf of the appellant.
Sure, if this is on. Good morning, Mr. Examiner. My name is Brian Telligen. I'm counsel for Preserve Providence Heights. I sent out a notice of appearance on Friday to Ms. Beer. I don't know if you got it. Would you like a copy?
That could be helpful, and I appreciate if you bring that forward because I will trade with you copies of the exhibit and witness lists that have been prepared by the parties. And that could be distributed, one for you, one for the applicant. And we have applicant counsel here. Who will be the lead counsel for the applicant?
Jack Madwell on behalf of Church Home, and also Reese Farron on behalf of Church Home.
Very good. And then the city also is represented here today, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Jack Issaquah City Attorney's Office on behalf of the City of Issaquah staff. With me is
Okay, I'm not certain we have recording devices for the city. Maybe we can. We have microphones here on dais. These, I believe, are both recording and amplification, so it would be helpful. We have a witness area. We're at a microphone there, but one on this table would be helpful. Do you need a microphone itself? Is that something you need? Okay. All right, so we'll make certain we have recording device for the city table. I don't have a lot of introductory remarks. I appreciate that you've each filed witness and document list. The process we typically follow in an appeal of this type is that the documents that you filed would be deemed admitted unless there's an objection raised during the course of the appeal hearing. The primary purpose of the hearing itself, the open record appeal hearing, is to allow the appellant to first present your case through witnesses and documents, and then the applicant and the city to respond to that presentation. It should not be assumed that I have thoroughly reviewed every exhibit. I am generally familiar, but in my decision, I'll reference those exhibits that you refer to during the course of the appeal hearing. It's my understanding that a lot of material can be filed that might not be referenced during the hearing. It's important that you do that, to bring that to my attention if you want me to consider it in the decision. The testimony given today must be given under oath or affirmation, and that will be administered to the witness at the time you call the witness. Are there any questions about the procedures? I don't see any, so I think then, excuse me, Mr. Farron.
Yeah. That's on. Mr. Examiner, one issue that I'd like to raise is with respect to exhibit number that we've identified, and that's B24. It's the recorded testimony of our witnesses at the July 11th and August 8th hearings. And so what we thought might make this hearing more efficient is to be able to incorporate some of the testimony, the direct and cross-examination testimony. So we both listed it as them as witnesses and incorporated the testimony. And that might save, particularly on our side, some time in reintroducing the same witnesses to say the same things. But I didn't know how your Honor, Mr. Examiner, how you intended to deal with that issue.
Well, I made a brief remark in my introductory remarks and how I intend to handle that. I don't have a transcription of that testimony. If you have a transcription of it and highlight or identify certain parts of it that you want me to consider, I will then consider it. But my remark was, just because you submitted a document or referenced some materials doesn't mean that I am going to consider that in my decision. I think it's the purpose of this type of hearing for, particularly when all parties are represented by counsel, to bring to my attention those documents and those sections of the documents that you believe are important for me to consider. It would be very unwieldy and inefficient for me to go through everything that's been filed as a document or referenced in what you each have filed. And this isn't just with reference to your materials, but that applies to what the city and also the appellant might have filed. I think it's incumbent upon the attorneys to focus in on that material you want me to consider. So I'm aware that some of the issues were addressed in an earlier hearing, and this primarily for the appellant. You will understand my earlier ruling. If the issue is not carried forward in the appeal hearing, it's not one I'm going to put into a decision. It needs to be brought forward. And the same would go for any rebuttal testimony or reference to exhibits. Just because you said I reference all that material previously presented at another hearing, that's not going to be enough for me to use that in any decision. Draw to my attention those specific aspects of that you want me to consider. Does that seem fair to you?
It does, thank you. And I think there may be times where we may want to specifically identify those aspects of the recorded hearing, just specific testimony that we would like you to consider.
And that would be fine. If there's no objection, then I'm able to consider that, and I would appreciate your ability to do that. That will really help me in making a decision.
One thing
No, I have to issue the findings and conclusions with reference to the record, and that's where I really rely upon you and your professional colleagues to draw my attention to those aspects of the record that are important.
Mr. Examiner, just to clarify, we have recordings, video recordings of that last hearing. Could those be admitted as an exhibit, understanding what, of course, what you just said about your consideration of them?
Well, this is how we proceed, and I need to go over my remarks more slowly, I can see. The documents that you identified on the submittal of your witness and document list are considered to be part of the record unless there's an objection brought forward during the course of the hearing. In direct response to your, what is really hypothetical to me at this point, if you present a video recording and reference specific sections of it, at that time, if there's no objection, I would consider it. Premature for me to know if there would be any objection to that. So I'm not going to directly respond and say, certainly all video recordings are something I will review and I will consider, and I will go through hours of testimony and look for that specific nugget that you'd like me to consider. I'm not going to do that. But if you bring to my attention the specific sections and there's no objection, then certainly that would be considered.
I guess my request is narrower than that. We, in our exhibit list, we, I think it's B24, indicated that, that we wanted as an exhibit to be the testimony, recorded testimony of our witnesses. But we didn't at that time have a copy of the video recording yet, and we obtained copies of that. So it's more a question of just putting that. I think we just, in B24, I think we just cited to the video recording online. We had a YouTube, Ms. Baer gave us a link.
Yes, that's what's in the
And so then we
list.
had copies made. And so we just wanted this to be in the exhibit list, with the understanding that you'll consider those things that we bring to your attention, but we wanted this to be considered B24, instead of just what we had there, kind of a placeholder for it.
Well, again, if you present that during the course of the hearing in response to, I don't know what the appeal issues will be brought forward today, but if you believe that's important to consider in response to what the appellant might bring forward today, then at that time we'll consider. I can't make an advanced ruling to say I'm going to consider all those CDs that you're holding in your hand as part of my review before I make a decision. If there are specific aspects that are in response to an appeal issue presented today, then we'll consider them at that time. Fair enough?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Did you want to say anything, Mr. Telligent, with response to that?
One other preliminary matter I'd like to discuss with you. On Preserve Providence Heights witness list, one of our first witnesses was Miss Julie Kohler, who we identified as an expert on historical preservation and historical significance. Miss Kohler, I've learned, suffers from tuberculosis, and she's willing to testify, but she would rather not due to her physical condition. And I understand also sort of how the medications affect her. Now, on Friday, we submitted, or we sent around primarily to provide notice of an alternate witness who would speak on the same topics and the same issues. I'm just wondering if you would be willing to allow us to call Ms. Lauren McCroskey on the same issues and the same topics, and to allow Ms. Kohler to go home, and if there was any objections from opposing counsel, if you are even willing to entertain that.
I've not seen that. Do you have a copy to bring forward?
He didn't understand.
Okay. Okay, are there any objections to the replacement witness?
No, Your Honor.
Okay.
No objection. I think we'll end up substituting a witness for Karen Wayland. Actually, we've listed Sister Judith Desmarais, and I think we will later identify the specific testimony of Ms. Wayland by recording and CD. So no objection to
Okay.
Ms. McCroskey.
Doing some trades here, it sounds like.
Oh, I didn't know that was a
Trying to get
trade,
along.
but thank you.
Well, I think he's asking, are you going to object to their witness, or it's,
Well, we've identified Sister Judith, but we're
Yeah.
also going to identify specifically and call out specifically Karen Wayland's testimony in the prior hearing.
let's wait until that comes up. All we're looking at now is,
This is the CD issue? Is that what?
I think so.
Something on the CD?
I think I'm going to get multiple efforts to respond to that CD issue.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to do that at this time. We have a
Understand.
simple request, may
Understand.
he present an alternate witness? And the answer is, yes, you may.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner.
Are you ready to proceed then?
I am. Thank you.
Please go forward.
So we're here challenging the threshold determination of the demolition of the Providence Heights campus. It's a very historically significant campus in Issaquah. We have witnesses who can speak to that. I don't want to say a whole lot before calling our witnesses. I will say that I think that the standard ultimately for judging this threshold determination, this is from a recent case called Conservation Northwest versus Okanagan County. It's an unpublished decision, 194 WINAP 1034 from 2016. Says that the agency must take the requisite hard look at the environmental concern, and the initial assessment must indicate that the agency has taken a searching, realistic look at the potential hazards, and with reasoned thought and analysis, candidly and methodically address those concerns. We have identified a number of issues in our appeal statement. We don't think that standard has been met in a number of instances, and I hope that our witnesses, or I think our witnesses will bring that out for you today. So if I may begin, I'd like to call Ms. Susan Hass, the president of Preserve Providence Heights. Sorry, perhaps I missed it. Did we cover where the witnesses were sitting? I didn't hear that part. Where the witnesses would be sitting, is it over there?
Well, you have some different opportunities. Typically, a witness at the witness stand where Ms. Haas has made her way. Is that comfortable for you? Does that work for you?
Yes, I just didn't hear that part of the opening, so I wasn't sure.
That'll work just fine.
Thank you.
Good morning to you. If you'd please raise your right hand and take the oath. You swear to tell truth and testimony you give today.
Yes, I swear to tell the truth from the testimony I give today.
Thank you. If you'd please step there in front of the microphone, your attorney will have some questions to guide your testimony. And I don't think you've appeared in front of me before, but you're free to do narrative testimony. It doesn't have to be to the same formality as a trial court proceeding. So guiding your witness is fine into the areas that you'd like to go.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Susan.
Good morning, Brian.
Can you just tell me, for the record, could you just state your name and spell your last name?
It's Susan Hass, and it's spelled Hass like strawberry.
Where do you live?
I live at 19524 Southeast 24th Place in Sammamish, which used to be Issaquah, just adjacent and close to Providence Heights campus.
Okay.
Not just adjacent, sorry, to Issaquah, Sammamish is, and I live somewhat near Providence Heights campus.
Can you tell me, what do you do for a living?
I take care of animals as a pet sitter, and I make visual art with a specialization in wildlife indigenous to Washington State, and sell the art through Millstream, which is a nature-oriented gallery on Bainbridge Island.
And can you tell me a bit about your education?
Sure. I have a bachelor's in studio art and philosophy from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, and a master's in regional planning with emphases in land use and transportation from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
And before you were, well, maybe not before you became a visual artist, before your current sort of jobs or hobbies, can you tell me some about your past work experience?
Definitely. After my master's, my first job was with the state of Minnesota. I moved to Minnesota from Chapel Hill and took a job with the Environmental Quality Board, which is part of Minnesota's Office of Strategic and Long-Range Planning. I was part of a project that the governor initiated called the Sustainable Development Initiative. And then that ended, and then I became part of the community-based planning project in the same agency. And my work was involving doing lots of public meetings, working on policies, researching what other states do, including Washington State, working with legislators and their aides, writing a statute, and that sort of thing. Yeah, and then I did independent consulting after that in community planning.
Thanks. You talked about going to Providence Heights, I think, in connection with your artwork. Could you tell us a little more about your personal connection to the Providence Heights campus?
Yeah, I went there to go to water aerobics classes when the YMCA was renting the campus. And I went to several, and I spent time there also. When I would go there, I would also spend time on the grounds because I was struck by how incredibly unusual those grounds are in this locality in terms of the peace and the wildlife I saw and how it seemed like a sanctuary for wildlife. So I would observe wildlife, and that helps my art. Yeah.
And can you tell me, you're the president of Preserve Providence Heights, yes?
Yeah, Preserve Providence Heights is an all-volunteer group. It's a 501c3 group. And by the way, none of our witnesses are paid. None is. And our board has 2 vice presidents, a secretary, and then I'm both the board president and the board treasurer.
And why did, I'm going to refer to Preserve Providence Heights as PPH.
Okay.
Why did PPH form?
PPH formed to advocate for preservation of the campus, which has been designated as a historic landmark by the city of Issaquah.
And PPH is involved in a lawsuit with, I believe, the applicant in this case. I'm going to call the applicant Church Home. I believe that's the sort of parent organization. Could you tell me about that lawsuit and PPH's involvement in that lawsuit?
Churchome sued the city and the county, and Preserve Providence Heights formed down in Olympia with the Secretary of State on November 17th. After finding out that Sammamish Heritage Society was changing their focus to just Sammamish because the campus is in Issaquah. So PPH formed on November 17th, and we made a motion in King County Superior Court to intervene in that lawsuit that Churchome had brought against the city and the county. And that is how we got involved. And then we had a second motion. When the judge granted that motion, we had a second motion. Did I say to intervene? The first motion was to intervene. The second one was to vacate the settlement between the city and Churchome. And the judge granted that too, and then we just went on from there. Yeah. So we're still involved in that lawsuit. It's still active. Mm-hmm.
And the Issaquah School District is currently in the process of condemning the property, right?
Yeah, as I understand it, the school district has had a condemnation lis pendens in the property title since July 2016. And to my knowledge, that's still there. But what PPH has been told by people from the school district is that the last that is on hold because they don't want it. If it has, yeah, they only want it if it is been demolished. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you have your set of exhibits up there?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What do we know, or what do you know about the planned school?
I know that it's actually 2 schools. I know that the plans all refer to the exhibit numbers here.
It's Exhibit A11.
Thank you. Yeah, the first exhibit we have for that, we retrieved from the Issaquah School District's website just this past May. So if you please turn to Exhibit A11, it's just a single page, and it's a drawing. You'll see a big white shape, and that shape is the three of the 4 parcels that are owned by Churchome. And the school district is planning on using the new city zoning for community facilities, facility zoning, which allows for it's different now so that there aren't as many buffers, and there's higher heights allowed and 90% impervious surface. So this white shape right now is mostly forest with the campus buildings in the middle.
You're referring to sort of the triangular shape, not the call out, but that's sort of the with the football field and the new high school and future elementary school.
Yeah, this is the concept plan. It's titled on here that by the school district new high school concept plan, but as you see, there is a future elementary just on the far west, and then there is a new high school planned also, and fields and that sort of thing. The call out, the little rectangle is a detail of a parking facility. Mm-hmm.
This document refers to a satellite transportation center. Do you know what that is?
I believe that is a satellite transportation center for buses, for basically like a big bus rodeo, you know. A bus corral, yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Bus corral. Do you know, has there been any other plans for developing the Providence Heights campus other than for a school?
Have there been other plans?
Yeah, that you're aware of.
Can you ask me a little more about what you mean by plans, or? Yeah.
Well, other than develop, so Church Home is submitted to demolish the building. Are there any other projects that you're aware of to develop that project other than for a school?
Yeah, Preserve Providence Heights does a lot of communication with other parties that have expressed interest in using the campus. There are only 2 parties so far that have gotten quite far in that process, where they've talked with city staff, for example. But there are a lot of parties that we have been in communication with, and as we understand it from a real estate agent who's very experienced with large properties, there would need to be more proactive willingness on the part of Church Home in order for other such plans to come into being. Yeah.
And those are people that you've been that PPH has been sort of working with, is that correct?
Yes, affordable housing groups, 2 churches, performance groups, and then a gentleman named John Benjamin and a woman named Christine Soul, and the entities that they work with. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, our appeal statement lists many different issues that we take with the threshold determinations. I'm wondering if you could sort of walk us through what you view as being the deficiencies of the threshold determination. Which areas are you concerned about?
Okay, I'd be glad to. For me, this has to do, I think, in the way to answer this question, in terms of the best use of time today, probably aligns with who the witnesses are that Preserve Providence Heights is calling today, because we have narrowed down the issues quite a bit. The MDNS, we feel, does not give adequate consideration of the historic significance apart from the landmarking itself, and also does not consider the importance of embodied energy and the need to conserve energy in this era of global warming. The MDNS does not adequately recognize the Providence Heights campus as a housing resource. It has been a housing resource in the past for students and other people and convention goers and sisters, and it could be in the future, especially for people who need it the most. It's exactly the kind of housing the city of Issaquah needs, which is small dwelling units, extremely affordable dwelling units for either single people or couples. And we feel the MDNS does not adequately consider the impact, basically how that campus could serve the performing arts community and the human services needs that are being shouldered by the libraries, for example, and a lot of schools. There's a lot of cranky musicians out there with, they're rehearsing in basements. So it doesn't adequately consider the promise of the cultural aspects. And as that relates to tourism and economic development, major financial tax advantages for the city of Issaquah to bring in people, to have them visit, and that those uses, human services and performing arts, are extremely compatible on 41 acres or 200,000 plus square feet. So we also believe that this MDNS does not adequately consider, well, I've already mentioned wildlife, but the hazards to the planet, to ecosystems in this locality, and to human health that involve potential sulfur soil contamination, potential diesel soil contamination, and PCBs that are known to be there in transformers. That were,
Can I stop you just for 1 second?
Yes.
On that last topic, sulfur, diesel, and PCBs, why do you think those are on the campus?
Okay, well, I'd like to draw your attention to Exhibit A9, which is a letter from James Culver. He was a facilities engineer on campus after he was a student there, and he worked there, I believe last year in his testimony here, he said it was 4 years that he held that position. So he was extremely familiar with the heating system and all sorts of other things. And in his letter, he talks about, the first paragraph he's talking about his experience. The second paragraph he's talking about PCBs that are on campus that are not recognized in the Rhine Waste Management Plan. The third paragraph he's talking about high sulfur number 6 fuel oil. When Lutheran Bible Institute owned the campus, they had underground storage tanks with this sort of oil in them. And James said that Lutheran Bible Institute removed the tanks because they were leaking, but that they didn't do anything about testing the soils or doing any soil remediation for that. So that's why he is writing that he believes that could be a problem there. And then he also writes about diesel in the last paragraph, which is the same situation. Lutheran Bible Institute had diesel stored underground in tanks. The tanks are gone now, but as far as he knows, nobody has tested, including Lutheran Bible Institute, whether there is any diesel contamination of those soils. So that is why I'm bringing up. That's why I'm bringing up those hazards. And would I be able to just run over there and get one more binder? Is that possible?
Certainly.
I can also grab it for you. Tell me which one.
I just need the. Okay, thank you for your patience. I wasn't anticipating needing this up here, but this is great. So I'm just also still answering this question about sulfur, diesel, and PCBs. There is an exhibit called B is in boy 8_1. So if you could possibly turn to that. It's an exhibit that Church Home provided that is a regulated building materials assessment report. And in this assessment report, it's kind of a lot to flip through probably. For time reasons, it may be better for me to just read the highlighted parts I have, if that's okay. But if you want me to wait, yeah.
Can you reference page numbers of
Yes,
that
most
report?
definitely, sure. On page 1 of that report, I'm looking at the last paragraph of page 1 of the Argus report, yeah. Page 1 is what it's actually on the paper. It's a different page on the electronic file, but the paper on the report says page 1. Okay, the last paragraph, the second to last sentence says, PCB containing electrical transformers were observed in the subgrade electrical vaults. Now I'm turning to page 38 of the same report. And then on that page, under 5.1 methodology, universal wastes, the first paragraph there, just toward the end of that first line, it says PCB containing electrical transformers. And then if you turn to the next page, 39, there's table 5.2-1. And the fourth item from the bottom is PCB containing electrical transformers. And it says there are 6, approximately, which is the same number that James Culver says are in the buildings in his letter. So, and then on page 50, if you're willing, if you turn to page 50, please, of the Argus report. Sorry. Okay, the last paragraph there, the third line of the last paragraph, toward the end of the line, it mentions PCB transformers. And then page 51, well, yeah, actually toward the end of page 50, there is a statement of what this report doesn't cover. And it says, evaluation of other risks not specifically described in the scope of work have not been included. For example, and then there's all sorts of things they list there. And then the next page, on page 51, the last part of that list is, and evaluation of toxic and hazardous substances in or in contact with soil and groundwater. Their scope of work was the buildings and not the grounds. And they did find the PCBs in the transformers. And I would love to turn your attention also to an exhibit from from the city, in exhibit C8, which is the Rhine Waste Management Plan. And just to give you a little background, the Argus report was almost exactly 2 years ago, June 3rd, 2016, and the Rhine Waste Management Plan is from February 2017. So it's C8. I didn't find this in the church home documents, but I did find it in the city documents, yeah. Exhibits, I mean. And I'm looking at page 4, which is the introduction. And then in the introduction, it says this waste management plan at the very beginning, developed by Rhine, describes the technical approach proposed to manage the transportation and disposal of the identified wastes. So only identified, basically. Then if you could please turn to page 8 of that same exhibit. Okay, for the very top of that page is 4.2.2, hazardous/regulated waste streams. And it says hazardous/regulated materials to be generated during the performance of this project will be as follows. And there is a list there, and PCB light ballast is the second on the list. There is no mention of any other PCB contaminated items. There is no mention of the transformers, the 6 transformers that are underground. And if you could please turn to page 9 now of that same exhibit. Sorry, I'm kind of got to slow down here. Page 9.
I'm following you. I'm on page
You
9.
are? Okay, great. 5.1, remedial overview. Other than the removal and disposal of the identified regulated/hazardous materials, no other remedial activities are planned. And then I have one more page to show you in this exhibit, page 15. Appendix A. of the Rhine plan. And then if you look at the first rectangle on the top, the very bottom row says total reclaim / eco lights northwest. This is where they are, and then the next column, it says PCB light ballast. And in this list of where these materials will be delivered for disposition, there is no mention of the PCB transformers, the 6 underground PCB transformers. So it seems to me from reading this that Rhine's plan has no consideration of the 6 PCB transformers, and there might very well be other significant things that it doesn't consider, but I'm just bringing up that one thing because it's extremely significant to human health and planetary health. So there's another witness who will talk more about PCBs, but PCBs are extremely hazardous. They travel far, they stay in the environment, and they also bioaccumulate. So if you get PCBs in algae and a little fish eats the algae and a bigger fish eats that fish and on up the line, then that's what I understand about PCBs. And my concern, why I'm spending so much time talking about this, is because I think it is a real danger to bring to everybody's attention. I think it could be a tremendous concern, and if this MDNS isn't withdrawn and an EIS required because of this and other reasons, this could lead to a very large liability issue for Church Home and the city.
They know all about it.
Thanks. Do you know if the environmental checklist disclosed the presence of PCBs?
It did not. I'm trying to see. Do you have a copy of the checklist handy, or I don't know if I have that.
I believe it's.
Sorry.
Let's see what. Where it is. C7.
Okay, I would like to please turn your attention to Exhibit C7. Yeah, C7 is the SEPA environmental checklist that was submitted on February 16th, 2017. So that is several months after the Argus report was prepared in June 2016. And that was signed by Eric Rosenlund, Director of Real Estate Development for Church Home. So this checklist, unfortunately, has a lot of inadequacies, but there are. I would turn your attention, please, to page 9 of that checklist. There's a number 7 toward the bottom is environmental health. And then if you turn to page 10, number 1, the question that asked in this questionnaire provided by the city says, describe any known or possible contamination at the site from present or past uses. And the answer is there is no known or expected contamination on the site. In addition to the water tower, 2 above-ground storage tanks were observed on the site. One was identified as a propane tank and the other a diesel fuel storage tank. There was no evidence of spills or leakage at either tank site. Vent pipes or fill ports associated with the underground storage tanks were not found on site. Existing buildings on the site will likely have asbestos. And then, more importantly, number 2, under that, still on page 10, it says describe existing hazardous chemicals / conditions that might affect project development and design. This includes underground hazardous liquid and gas transmission pipelines located within the project area and in the vicinity. So the answer from Church Home is there are no known existing hazardous chemicals or conditions that would affect the proposed demolition. And then they mention a Puget Sound gas pipeline. And then number 3, the question is, describe any toxic or hazardous chemicals that might be stored, used, or produced during the project's demolition or development or construction or at any time. Sorry, that's more about construction. And proposed number 5, toward the bottom of the page, proposed measures to reduce or control environmental health hazards, if any. That's the question. The answer Church Home provides is that state regulations about safety and handling would apply. And then the last sentence, demolition waste containing regulated materials such as asbestos and lead will be handled according to state regulations and recommendations. So I think the main part is question 2, where the answer is there are no known existing hazardous chemicals or conditions that would affect the proposed demolition. I would say that if I had been answering that truthfully, I would have said there are hazards and these are the hazards. Yeah, and because this was written in February 2017, the Argus report gave an extremely lengthy inventory in June 2016.
I know on page 10 of Exhibit C7, which is the SEPA checklist, it also says there was no evidence of spills or leakage at either tank site. Is that consistent with the James Culver letter? I believe it's Exhibit A9.
In Exhibit A9, James Culver is mentioning that he thinks that the tanks were removed because of leakage and that Lutheran Bible Institute probably didn't test for soil contamination. I think in this checklist, in that particular question and answer, I don't think that is an adequate question and answer. As a community planner, that doesn't answer enough detail on what's going to happen if we demolish this of over 200,000 square feet and what could be there. Yeah, so there is a saying there's nothing there and there's no leakage, but how is that substantiated? Where is the evidence? Was there testing? Was there not? Argus didn't do it. I don't see any other exhibits from Church Home about that or the city. But that issue needs to be addressed. And that's why I think an EIS is appropriate.
So, before I cut you off to sidetrack us on the hazardous substances, I think you were sort of tripping through the various issues we have with the MDNS. I think you had mentioned social services, wildlife, hazardous substances. I can't recall if housing was wrapped in on the social services, but are you able to continue on with that sort of monologue?
Yeah, housing is definitely wrapped in with social services for this. I mentioned them separately because there are 2 witnesses to talk about those, one focusing entirely on housing and one more broadly on social services. And I guess I would just say, in terms of the housing and social services, the other witness may talk about this, but I had personal correspondence with Mr. Keith Niven and also Martha Sassarosi, is that how you say her name? Sassarosi, because I was wondering how the zoning for this particular place, which is single-family small lot, whether nonprofit and human services could include overnight services. And Keith reached out to Martha in the Office of Sustainability, as the director there, to ask her to interpret that city code, and she replied that could definitely be overnight services, and it could be for a shelter, it could be for women fleeing domestic violence. transitional housing and that sort of thing. So, and then Keith graciously forwarded me that email. So that's quite confirmation, yeah, of that. But I think I pretty much reviewed all the other issues. Just what? What? Trees. Oh yeah. Well, yeah, and the trees, because in the SEPA, in the elements of the environment in the Washington state law, it does talk about effects on animals and plants. And I, as an artist, mostly work with animals, but plants are a big part of this too. Yeah. Actually, in this. Yeah, and then the SEPA checklist, which is the C7 again, it just basically says that no vegetation will be harmed or removed in the case of the demolition, except for potentially some ornamental plants. But there has been a lot of vegetation removed, and demolition has not even begun. There's been only asbestos abatement so far. And also there are...
Can you
Yeah, sure.
Can you talk about more about that, about what kind of damage has been done from the asbestos abatement and how that's affected the vegetation and so forth?
Yeah.
Were these your run-of-the-mill ornamental plants?
I don't know. They were beautiful when I was there. I loved to be around them. There were, like big, either rhododendrons or azaleas. There are a lot of older trees there on the campus, as I have heard from an old timer that I volunteer with at the Issaquah Food Bank. There have been at least one tree removed during the asbestos abatement, and a lot of vegetation has been scraped away, and I mean a lot, and it's pretty gnarly looking. So and we're not talking about the architecture even, we're just talking about the vegetation. There have been many, many windows removed as part of the asbestos abatement, but yeah, there's been a lot of vegetation removed, and the checklist claimed that wouldn't happen. And then the checklist just talks about funny things like birds and mammals as identified above. I'm sorry, I'm looking at pages. Page 8 is plants and animals. So I'm just going to walk through this a little more slowly. On page 8 of C7, it lists the plants. And then under 4B, it says, what kind and amount of vegetation will be removed or altered? The answer is no vegetation is expected to be removed as a part of this demolition. Some ornamental plants may be damaged. So then 4D says proposed landscaping to preserve or enhance vegetation on the site, and the answer is existing vegetation on site will remain as is. And then in number 5, it mentions animals, and the animals listed are songbirds, deer, bear, squirrels, and raccoons. But maybe you don't want me to get into animals yet, but...
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
If you could talk about that issue.
Hawks, and then on page 9 at the very top, which is 5B, it says birds, the second sentence is birds and mammals as identified above may occasionally cross over or through the site. Hawks and eagles may occasionally fly over the site, but no evidence of their presence was identified. And as somebody who visited there, I know that songbirds more than occasionally cross over or through the site. And I've also seen rabbits there quite a bit. I think that they live there. They're always on the site, yeah. And hawks and eagles, as somebody who lives in the area, they frequently fly over this whole town. But especially where they can find prey, which is at Providence Heights. So I think that I'd also like to just draw your attention to another exhibit, which is A19, and that is a letter. That's from, it's just a very brief exhibit that's written by Sue McGill. It was a public comment last year for the last year's MDNS. And in this letter, I'm first going to look at the second page, actually. The very last paragraph before the last sentence. Sue McGill, this address that, by the way, is in Providence Point, which is a retirement community that used to be part of Providence Heights, and then it was sold, and it's adjacent to Providence Heights. But the second to last paragraph on that exhibit, on the second page of that exhibit, she writes, "I've spent over 30 years working for the National Park Service in wildlife areas, so I can say with certainty these animals exist in the proposed work area. In order to be a complete document, they should be noted in the document." And by that document, she's referring to the checklist. Actually, on the first page, the top, she says, "Dear Mr. Niven, a couple comments related to the environmental checklist for the permit." So, and then in her letter, she talks about the first page, the first number, she lists bobcat. She says numerous, she says that she's seen them numerous times at Providence Point, and she's personally watched the cats go over the fence into what she calls the church property on 2 occasions in the early morning. And bobcats are definitely around here. Then number 2, she writes, there are also coyote. She has heard them on the church property is the last sentence of that line. So she's heard coyotes on the property. And then the third paragraph, she talks about how there are owls at Providence Point. So I was really glad to read her letter, just to read how much wildlife there is there. Yeah, and I'd just like to bring to your attention Exhibit B43, which was provided by Church Home. It has a lot of photographs to tell you what I cannot tell you in words about the changes that have happened there since the asbestos abatement began in early December, as I understand it. So you'll see photographs that show a lot.
I just have a couple more questions.
Great.
One, earlier we were talking about PPH trying to sort of generate public interest in reusing this place, and you had mentioned there were many people who were interested in that. All of those people want to not demolish the campus, correct?
Yes.
Can you also just, do you have the PPH's exhibits on hand? Can you just identify for me Exhibit A13? Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah. A13 is the Liz Pendens. Basically, that means pending lawsuit, as I understand it in Latin.
I'm sorry, I asked you, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I misidentified the exhibit. I'm talking about A12.
A12, okay. All right. A12, the Declaration of Jacob Cooper?
Yes.
Okay.
That was a document submitted in the lawsuit, correct? In the lawsuit you're involved in with Church Home?
Yes.
And on paragraph 8 on page 3, it says, in the event that plaintiffs are prohibited from demolishing the existing improvements on the property, the district will not be able to use the property to construct the school it needs. Is that consistent with your understanding? I know that you track, for example, the school district. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Yes, they've been extremely consistent over time. That is a great strength of theirs. Total consistency of their message. They do that. They have said that for two reasons verbally. That one is that they have their own plans for how to put the buildings there, and they don't want to repurpose the campus, even though it's repurposable. And other schools have repurposed buildings all over the world. But the other reason is that they don't want to subject students to Christian imagery, the imagery of the stained glass windows in the chapel. Our BPH board secretary actually even suggested, why not just put some curtains up during school hours, or things like school functions. But the school district chief financial officer, superintendent, and then president Lisa Callan said, well, it's a constitutional problem. They're saying for federal reasons, something having to do with the right to religious freedom, perhaps, constitutionality, they cannot have those images near the kids, even if the school didn't own the chapel, that they would be near the kids. Mm-hmm.
So the school district has made clear that they need this property demolished.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you feel the hearing examiner should know from you today before I listen to you?
Let me see here. Well, as a natural area, I think it is quite unique to Issaquah because it is in this northern area of Issaquah, which is not where the mountains are with the parks and the trails and, yeah, a lot of all those public parks. If you're interested in where the letter came from James Culver about the hazardous waste, he wrote that just this May. Yeah, I think there are some other exhibits in here that just show where the school district is coming from. You saw the site plan. There's a declaration of Jake Cooper. The Liz Pendens is just there. The declaration from Troy Anderson, I guess I'd draw your attention to Exhibit A5, please. What? A15, okay, thanks. We'll go for A15 too. But A5, the third page of this declaration from Troy Anderson, well, never mind. That's just about the school district said they're interested. A6, if you're willing to bear with me and turn to A6, please. Page 3, number 7. Oh, thanks. Okay. Number 7, the second sentence that is Troy Anderson.
Hold on
Sorry.
a minute, because I don't have that.
I'm
I
sorry.
think you meant A16.
Okay. I'll go to A16, but I would also really like to just visit briefly A6, please. Yeah.
So A6 is the needs analysis? Is that what you're referring to?
Oh, I wonder if I messed up in these binders. I am trying to get to the declaration of Troy Anderson in response to the motion to intervene.
That is Exhibit A16.
A16.
Oh, okay, thanks, okay. Okay. Oh, thanks, okay, A16, thank you, okay. So on page 3 of this exhibit, if we go to number 7, the second sentence says, the condemnation proceeding is currently stayed pending resolution of the defendant's attempts to impose restrictions on the property based on its historic significance. So the condemnation proceeding is currently stayed pending resolution of the defendant's attempts to impose restrictions on the property based on its historic significance. I mean, that's referring to the landmarking, but I just wanted to give you a quick look at that to note that that's what Church Home believes too, that the school district is waiting, and that's why they're waiting, yeah. Thank you.
And then do you have a copy of Exhibit CC7? It's a city exhibit.
I don't appear, but if I can borrow that white binder, I could. Okay, I've got CC7 open. The order for consent judgment in part and permanent injunction.
Correct. That's an order that was recently issued in the lawsuit you're involved in, correct? And I think it is beginning on page 5. The court enters a permanent injunction.
Which number, or I'm sorry, Brian, but which?
I was just directing you to page 5, and then I'm looking at paragraphs B and C.
B and C, okay.
Paragraph C says defendant City of Issaquah and defendant King County, the latter only to the extent it acts on behalf of the city pursuant to their interlocal agreement, and the enjoined parties are hereby prohibited from accepting any other nomination seeking designation of the property as a landmark for as long as Church Home owns the property. And then it's similar to above. It says that they are permanently enjoined and restrained from taking any action to declare, designate, or determine that the property is a landmark, or from otherwise applying or enforcing any provisions or requirements of the landmark ordinance against Church Home for as long as Church Home owns the property. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To your knowledge, if the school district were to take ownership of that property, do you know if this injunction would apply to actions to enforce the landmark code against the school district?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm going to object to.
That's a very-
legal question.
What's the basis for your objection?
It's a legal conclusion.
She's not qualified to speak as to a legal conclusion? Is that what you're,
Correct. Yes.
down the realm of her expertise?
Yes.
Is she a party to the action?
She was a party to the action, and she disputed this particular injunction. I've had many conversations with my client about this particular
I think
injunction.
as a party, not as a legal expert, she can certainly reply. Do you want to repeat that question?
Sure. Susan, do you have an understanding as to whether or not this particular injunction would preclude the city from enforcing the landmark ordinance against the school district, if the school district were to take possession of the property or ownership?
My understanding is that this Superior King County Court Judge, Julie Spector, and the way that Church Home presented this proposed order, was that it would only apply to Church Home for as long as they own the property. So fortunately, the landmarking still exists for anybody else who would ever own it, as long as the landmarking exists, as long as the city of Issaquah has that code. Yes. So this only applies to Church Home, and it certainly applies to the Issaquah School District.
So Church Home can demolish the structure, but the school district might not, essentially.
Church Home can demolish the school,
Of the
the
campus.
campus, only if they have permission from the city, which they don't. They only have an MDNS at this point, and the school district cannot. The school district, if it were interested in doing that, would need to apply to the Issaquah Landmarks Commission for a certificate of appropriateness. And if the Landmarks Commission were to allow that, then that would be a different story. But there is a pretty high bar, pretty high threshold for that sort of permission, as far as I understand it, from Jennifer Meissner, who's the King County Historic Preservation Officer.
I'm done with my questions. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? I already asked that once, but I didn't know if I cut you off.
I only want to add that even though we're in this appeal hearing, Preserve Providence Heights is interested in the greatest good for the public, and we believe that ultimately that interest is shared by a lot of other community members, over 500 people who signed a petition, probably have 150 people on our mailing list, people who regularly volunteer, and as I see things, the city and Church Home, just because we're all interested in wisdom, and we are trying to be very constructive, which is not always easy, but we want to, and we're trying to cooperate. Thanks.
Thank you. If you'd stay there just for a minute, please. Do you need a bit of a break, or are you okay to stay there? The city may have some questions for you. I'll give
thank
them
you.
an opportunity.
And I should say, Susan, I'm sorry, you should feel free to
Okay,
let them know how you feel physically.
Well, it's pretty enjoyable actually, and I have some water and I'm sitting down, so I'm okay, to
right.
continue. I'll
And
just
we'll-
grab my water.
And as soon as you're comfortable, we'll continue by allowing the city legal counsel to ask questions of you about the testimony you just gave, and then an attorney for the applicant as well. Mr. Lell, do you want to proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Ms. Haas, I have just a very few questions for you. First of all, I believe your testimony referred to time you spent on the Providence Heights campus during the period at which the YMCA leased the property? Approximately what time frame was that?
Well, they moved out, the YMCA was renting it from Church Home, then City Church, until April 2016. I think I was there mostly in 2015,
Thank you. And what was the most recent time that you were actually physically on the Providence Heights site?
It was around March 16th, I think it was. I had been invited by Christine Soul to join her to visit the site, and in retrospect, I decided, because she had showed me a text message from Leon Sandberg inviting her to visit the site, but not to go in the buildings, but to be on the grounds. So she felt it was okay to invite me, and I went, but in retrospect, I wish I hadn't done that, because I would have felt a lot better with written permission. So if any time in the future, I would only go if I had written permission from Church Home, or any property owner,
Thank you. And to clarify, did you actually enter the campus building during that visit?
No, I didn't even get close to the buildings. I went only up to the chain link fence.
Thank you. No further questions at this time.
Does the applicant have any questions for Ms. House?
Yes, Mr. Examiner, I have a number of questions. Let me ask you, so my back is to...
It's a bit awkward, isn't it?
Yeah, would you be offended if I switch my chair around and face...
Is your back to me?
Yeah.
No, that seems much more comfortable.
I mean, no disrespect.
Right.
This works. Ms. Haas, how are you doing now? Are you still able to go on?
Am I still able to go on? Yeah, it's not something I would do every day, but I'm okay right now.
Okay.
Thanks.
And let me know if you need to take a break at some point.
Okay.
So, as you know, my name is Reese Farron, and I represent Church Home, the applicant. I'm going to ask you a few follow-up questions on some of the topics that you testified about in reverse order. First, I want to ask you about your testimony about animals on the premises. And as a preliminary question, I want to ask you, is Ms. McGill going to testify if you know? Because I'll ask her those questions instead of you.
No.
Okay. So, Ms. Haas, other than Ms. McGill's note and your testimony, are you aware of any other evidence of animals on the property?
Well, there are a lot of documents I haven't looked through carefully. Church Home provided quite a few, about 1,800 pages worth during the discovery process with the court case. And there is a wetland inventory in there and a couple of environmentally sounding reports, but I haven't read. So they could be in there. There could be some mention in there.
Okay.
Any other inventory? I'm not aware of any. Yeah.
And the animals mentioned by Ms. McGill, the bobcat and the coyote, those aren't endangered animals, are they?
They definitely aren't endangered animals. I mean, they have a hard life sometimes because they're actually more friendly to people than people think, but they are not endangered, no.
And the owl mentioned on Ms. McGill's note, she didn't refer to that as a northern spotted owl, correct?
No, and she didn't even refer to it on the campus. She said it at Providence Point, yeah.
And the animals that have been mentioned, there's no evidence or reason to believe that they actually live that they make a habitat in the buildings. Is that right?
That's an interesting question. I've wondered that myself because the windows are gone except for the stained glass windows.
But no evidence that they actually live in the buildings.
I hope they don't. They'd be better off outside. Yeah.
Near where the buildings are being demolished, and that's the limit of the project that Church Home is proposing today?
What is the question? Could you please clarify?
Sure. You understand that Church Home is only proposing to demolish the buildings themselves, correct?
I understand they're proposing to demolish the buildings, but that doesn't mean the demolition project impacts are limited to the buildings. Yeah.
And you understand that there's nothing in the current proposal that involves cutting down any of the trees on the property?
There's already been at least one tree cut down. Yeah, and because of the machinery, because if you try to demolish a 200,000 square foot structure, you need some pretty big equipment, and it has an impact beyond the buildings themselves. So it does impact the animals I saw rabbits right next to the building, and I saw birds right next to the building, which is where I was with the YMCA. If you go farther out, like where the bonfire is, and the amphitheater, and the rest of the 41 acres with the trails, I would say then you're talking about, okay, maybe that is not within the scope of the demolition impacts, yeah.
All right. Let me ask you about plants. So the checklist at Exhibit C7 mentions alder, maple, aspen, fir, cedar, and pine. And you're not aware of any of those that have been removed, have you?
I don't know what kind of tree was removed and if there was more than one tree. There might be another witness who could address that later, but I don't know what it was. Yeah.
Now let me go to your testimony about what was disclosed on the checklist by Church Home. If you go to Exhibit C7.
Okay.
If you look at page 2 there.
Page 2. I think Mr. Examiner's turning to the exhibit, but you can't see that.
Have it.
You're going to have to help me.
Okay. Page 2 of C7.
Right. And if you look at item 8 on the checklist,
Yes.
you see that the entire Argus Pacific Regulated Building Materials Assessment Report is attached as a part of the checklist. Do you see that?
Yes.
So that means, doesn't it, that all of the information in the Argus report, including all the PCBs identified, have been identified as a part of the checklist, right?
No, it doesn't mean that.
All right. Now, and let me ask you, do you know if Mr. Culver is going to testify about his knowledge of PCBs or fuel oil on the property?
G. Michael Haas will be testifying, but on PCBs and, yeah, James
You can
Culver.
elaborate, but I don't think we couldn't get James Culver.
James Culver, yeah, we were hoping and trying, but he has his daughter has something at school today that he needs to be a part of.
Okay.
So he wasn't able to participate. But just back to your other question about does that incorporate everything with Argus, I think the spirit and the letter of the law when having a checklist like this is to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in every single question. So even if it is referenced, when there is a question that says, hey, are there hazardous materials here? The answer is, hey, this is what we know from the Argus report. Yeah, and it can be longer. You know, it's okay. It doesn't have to be this number of pages.
And wouldn't it also be true that somebody who intended to make full disclosure, like Church Home, would go out and hire a company like Argus to do a fairly intensive study and review of all the potential regulated materials and asbestos in the property, right?
Could you please, I'm confused about what you're asking or why you're asking it. Please, could you clarify or ask it in a different way, maybe?
Well,
Mr. Farron.
you'd agree that the Argus report is very detailed and comprehensive?
I am not a professional in that field, so I can't answer that question.
Okay. Let me ask you about page 50 on the Argus report, which is, I think, it's now Exhibit 8, B8.
Okay,
Okay.
I'm on page 50.
So I want to ask you about a question relating to how careful Argus was with their study. So if you look at paragraph 6.3,
Got it.
it reads fluorescent light tubes HID lamp switches and thermostats may contain mercury. Fluorescent light ballasts and HID lamp ballasts may contain PCBs. In Washington State, even ballasts labeled with no PCBs may have regulated amount of PCBs and therefore should be handled in accordance with Washington Department of Ecology requirements. And employers must inform their employees of mercury and PCB hazards in accordance with the WAC statute. You see that?
I do.
And then the report also says that these substances must be removed and recycled or disposed of prior to building demolition as per 40 CFR 262, 40 CFR 265, and WAC 173.303. Correct? Right.
I see that. I was impressed by that carefulness that they're saying, employees have to be taken care of. It all has to be handled according to state law. And it doesn't actually say anything about the, it's interesting you bring that up, because that last paragraph, fluorescent light tubes, HID lamps, switches, and thermostat light ballasts must be removed and recycled or disposed of prior to building demolition. So that does not say that the transformers need to be removed and recycled or disposed of prior to demolition, building demolition.
Okay. With respect to fuel oil in the ground, you don't have any evidence that there actually is fuel oil in the ground at the Plateau campus, do you?
Depends on what Mr. Examiner considers evidence. I guess I'm going back to Exhibit A9 for the letter from James Culver.
And do you know, I think your testimony was that the underground storage tanks had been decommissioned and removed. Were you aware of that?
Well, I'm looking at Exhibit A9, and Mr. Culver says that in paragraph 3, when he's talking about the high sulfur 6 fuel oil, he says, the third sentence is, these tanks were removed roughly 30 years ago because they were leaking. This project happened before my employment, but I was told about the problem by Richard Hovitt, one of the other engineers who was employed there at that time. And I'll go to the next paragraph, paragraph 4, where it's focusing on diesel. The second sentence says, there is a small house on the property near 228th Street Southeast that contains a large diesel generator, which also had an underground storage tank. This tank was also believed to be leaking. So around 2007, the tank was drained and a new above-ground diesel tank was installed. Then he goes on, it's important to keep in mind that there is an underground water supply that provides water to this facility and the other residents of the surrounding community. This facility has 2 wells located half a mile north of the main facility. I recall vaguely the wells were roughly 200 feet deep. Therefore, there is concern that the destruction of this facility could potentially contaminate the underground water supply. And I would add, that means there's a well comes from groundwater, and groundwater aquifers are often quite large. So if a well can be contaminated, or part of the groundwater, the contaminants can spread. They can spread and contaminate an entire aquifer. That's happened in a lot of places, as you've probably heard about. And I would also say that this property is, it's about 450 feet above sea level, which is on a big hill above Lake Sammamish. And in this catchment area, Lake Sammamish exists. So if the hazards were not ever taken care of or remediated with due diligence of knowing how to, people actually knowing how to do that and doing it really, really well, those hazards will be released into the ecosystem, into the soil, into the water. The water will flow down in this rainy climate to Lake Sammamish, which is already struggling. There's a kokanee. There was just an article in the Issaquah Sammamish Reporter a couple weeks ago about the kokanee salmon and how people are considering what to do for them, with potentially having them grow up at the hatchery and then releasing them, because their numbers have been really plummeting in recent years. So sounds like they're in great danger of going extinct. So so just to answer your question about those contaminants in the tanks, James says in the first paragraph, in the second paragraph, the sulfur one was removed because they were leaking, and then the diesel ones the tank was believed to be leaking. So we'd probably need to find out more from Lutheran Bible Institute if possible, see if, maybe they would have records that Church Home would be able to access. Mm-mm.
You weren't there when the underground storage tanks were removed, right?
Right.
And are you aware that the Department of Ecology requires and imposes certain regulations in connection with the decommissioning of storage tanks?
I would find that very believable.
Okay.
Yes. Whether people follow those or know about them, with all of the rules and regulations that exist, that is an entirely different question.
In terms of affordable housing, is somebody else going to testify about that too, or rather housing? Okay, I'm going to save those questions then.
I will be assisting that person, so yeah, but she will testify on that.
All right. So you testified about what you believe the school district intended to do and the plan that the school district had prepared. Mm-hmm. Do you know why that plan wasn't submitted in connection with the first appeal?
Why the school district plan wasn't submitted by Sammamish Heritage Society
Correct.
Last year? I have absolutely no idea. I wasn't involved.
When was the first time you saw that document?
The first time?
Right.
It was several months ago. I don't remember. Yeah.
And that's not a document that's filed with the city anywhere, is it?
Yes, it was in Preserve Providence Heights' public comment for this MDNS.
It wasn't filed as a part of a permit application or a pre-application request of the city, right?
That would be a good question for Mr. Niven or Mr. Hinton or Mr. Bond. Yeah, was it ever filed with the city? Can you tell me why you're asking, or can you ask it again somehow? Yeah.
I actually have a number of questions, and I'm getting close to the end here.
Okay.
So I want to ask you questions about PPH. You testified about how PPH was formed. Mm-hmm. And so Sammamish Heritage Society filed the first appeal of the MDNS, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you were a member of Sammamish Heritage Society at that time, right?
That's a good question. Not necessarily. The membership just expired, and it's a year membership. So I think I became a member after that. Yeah, definitely after. Mm-hmm.
Bear with me 1 second. I am looking for. I think I have your affidavit here somewhere.
May 1st.
Is
Thanks.
this an exhibit?
It was our exhibit. This was just for impeachment purposes only.
Did you say this is an exhibit or not?
It is not.
May I ask my PPH's lawyer, I think you instructed us to not introduce new paper today. Anything new visually to comply with the law?
Well, I guess I will object. Frankly, I don't think normally I think it would be okay. I don't know if the hearing examiner rules specify that you can introduce new evidence even if it's stricken
Well,
for impeachment.
Yeah, and this would be just standard impeachment.
I would ask,
If you're asking the hearing examiner
I
to
would wait
look
for the
at
hearing
it,
examiner to
Let's look at it
answer.
a different way. Her testimony, direct testimony, was about the formation of what we're calling PPH, and she testified she was the president and treasurer of PPH. That's what I recall about her direct testimony. Further, she said it's a 501c3 that was formed in November. So are your questions related to the PPH organization? Because it seemed to be you're going a different direction, and you might tell me where you're going, and I have a better idea of whether this document's of any interest to me at all. What's the purpose?
Well, this actually relates to the issue regarding whether this is really a second appeal of the same issues that Sammamish Heritage.
I think there's been a ruling on that, hasn't there? Whether this is the same appeal that's already been brought and decided?
And that it was based, I believe it was based in part on the fact that PPH was a different entity.
You think so? Can you point to where that is in the decision? Because I don't recall that being part of the decision. This is an appeal of a document that was remanded, a threshold determination was remanded, and a decision I made on the motion to dismiss is that it's a new MD&S. It's not the same MD&S. The organizational structure, frankly, I don't think was a relevant consideration in my decision. You can point to me where you think that is, but if that's the direction you're going, I don't really want to revisit that.
All right, yeah,
Is that where
that's
you're
not-
going? Are you going to renew a motion to dismiss? Is that the intent here?
No,
Mr.
no, it's
Chairman?
already, the motion was made and.
Yeah, so why are we interested in this then?
I can move on.
Okay, thank you.
So let me ask you, Ms. Haas, about your testimony about other things that that Church Home and others have looked at to do with respect to plans for the property. So you said that the school district was, you know that they're looking at putting schools on the property, right?
They're looking at, no, they're not doing that, and they're looking at acquiring the property.
All right.
Yeah.
And other parties have shown an interest in this property too, right?
You would probably know about that better than I, or we know of different parties, but yes, definitely.
Well, you're aware that Brixton Homes was a party that wanted to build up to 140 houses on the property, right?
I don't know what their wants were, but I know that there was a permit application at one point that timed out when it was incomplete. Yeah.
Right. And in terms of looking at other reasonable alternatives for the property, short of demolition, that can be accomplished, you've made efforts to try to find people who would be interested in developing or repurposing the property, correct?
I've made the efforts that I can make with the conditions that we have. And yeah, if Church Home and Preserve Providence Heights joined forces to do that, everything would be different. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned John Benjamin
Yes.
as somebody who was interested in trying to repurpose the property.
I don't know much about John Benjamin, but I can't say what his interests really are at this point. Yeah. But I did mention him. Yeah, I did.
And you were aware that we spoke to Mr. Benjamin in trying to look for other alternatives for the property?
You've told me that you talked with him personally. Yeah.
In fact, we met with Church Home and its attorneys, met with you and Mr. Telligan at one point in the past few months, correct?
Mr. Telligen, also, yes. I don't know if it was the past few months. Probably was, yeah. Yeah, there was a meeting
And to be fair, Reese, we signed a document saying we couldn't disclose anything
and-
that was said in that.
Nothing, I'm not going to ask any questions about what we discussed, just that we met.
The scope of her direct was that she is aware of other potential purchasers of the property that would repurpose it for other uses.
Right.
So that's where you're sticking with, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And in the 16 months since the demolition permit was first applied for in February 16, 2017, nobody has been able to come forward with an actual concrete plan that will provide Church Home with any economic value for the property. Is that right?
He made a statement, but he's asking a question. Are you aware of anyone that's come forward with a specific plan to purchase the property? I think you're making a distinction, am I correct? You may be aware of potential purchasers, but you want to know about any specific plan.
Yes.
Okay, that's a fine distinction, but are you aware of anything more detailed than of an interest?
May I ask the context of this question in terms of this hearing? How is this relevant to the
I think he's trying to get to
appeal?
how serious the interest might be. Maybe you can explain, Mr. Farron, what you mean by specific plan. A written proposal, an offer to purchase, a offer for first option. What exactly would you consider a specific plan?
I think
That might help her
I think
understand.
those are all excellent points and questions. Have you seen any other purchase offers, definite purchase offers for this property in the past 16 months?
Well, as I mentioned before, there is a real estate agent who has volunteered for Preserve Providence Heights, and she has said that she could find a buyer, but even more than the school district being a disincentive for a buyer or perhaps a discouragement, even more than that is just all we have. Let me say, last year when we were here, a woman and I, and another person in this room and I approached you all, Mr. Farron, Mr. Madwell, and members of Church Home also, Mr. Troy Anderson, Mr. Leon Sandberg, Mr. Eric Rosenland, and talked. And we said, what can we do to help? Do you want to sell this property? And Mr. Anderson said yes. And then we said, well, what do we do? What do we do if we find somebody? And he said, direct them to Mr. Madwell. So Preserve Providence Heights has produced a number of flyers, and one of them says, please contact Mr. Madwell if you have a lead or if you're interested at all, or if you would be willing to be a funder for, And so then we include Mr. Madwell's office phone number, a cell phone number, and an email address. And I had hoped that would be okay with Church Home, but it's a bit tenuous. It's like a year ago. I'm not sure if anything has changed with what kind of guidance they would want, who people would go to even. So it's a bit amorphous for us to try to. I'm just trying to convey what it's like to be in the shoes of Preserve Providence Heights. We don't see it when we're looking at the internet and typing in, is this in a real estate database? Is this on the market even? We don't want to misrepresent Church Home. We don't want to offend Church Home. So those are extreme disincentives for this magic to happen, where a buyer who wants to preserve this campus will come forward. We have been in a lot of communication. One of the other witnesses has especially been in communication with affordable housing groups, and I have two, including Low Income Housing Institute, who has historic preservation experience in Pioneer Square in Seattle, and in a number of other affordable housing groups. And there are these other parties who've been around, like Christine Soul and this new group of people she's working with, and John Benjamin and his entity, Better World Housing. And they have actually been in contact with Bricklin and Newman. They contact them and say, this is what we're thinking of. Have we seen anything on paper? Do we know, like, wow, these people want to close this deal with Churchome in June so that they can get their tax incentives as soon as possible from the county and the federal government? Like, that sure would be great.
Okay.
I love that idea.
Last few questions. So, were you aware that the only proposal of any kind that Churchome has received from anybody in the past 16 months was a proposal, not an offer, from John Benjamin, whom you referred, for a dollar amount less than the mortgage on the property?
I was not aware of that.
And with respect to PPH, do you know who its members are?
Yes.
Is Mr. Culver?
That's outside the scope of what she talked about.
Yeah, I'm going to have to rein this in a little bit. This is, I'm sure, of interest to many and maybe fascinating even. But let's remind that this is an appeal of a threshold determination. The issues raised have to do with, did the city appropriately disclose identified environmental impacts and provide for mitigation that's reasonable and capable of being accomplished? Or did the city not issue an appropriate MB&S such that either an environmental impact statement should be prepared or it should be remanded for further efforts by the city? That's the reason for this appeal. We've given a fair amount of leeway. This sounds like a very fascinating area to explore, but you might want to do that outside this hearing. And particularly with reference to the membership, where I just heard an objection, that is not relevant to this appeal. We had an opportunity to bring motions. It may have been relevant in the context of standing, but I didn't hear that raised in any motion. And so we're here in open record hearing today on the environmental impact of the proposal and the underlying demolition permit. Is that, and that's why you're here too, right?
Yes, Your Honor. And
Okay.
I only ask these questions about reasonable alternatives, other alternatives, because that's what the appeal statement said.
Well, that's interesting because
I objected to a membership question.
okay. So the membership I ruled on, so reasonable alternatives, that's what you're exploring with purchase options?
That's what I have done, yes.
I see. As to what uses it might be put to?
Correct.
All right. I didn't understand that. It seemed to me you were looking for purchase options. I didn't realize you were looking at use alternatives.
I'm a little confused if we're getting to alternatives. That's an EIS issue. I thought Mr. Farron was trying to make the point that the school is the only real possibility out there for this project, and that's really what the demolition is aiming at. Maybe I misunderstood Mr. Farron's point.
Well, that's what I've heard from the witness. You know, Ms. Haas is here with a lot of information, but I think she's been forthcoming in saying, I really don't have purchasers. I would love to have them to bring to you, but I don't have any in my back pocket that I've been hiding. So I think we know of what she testified in direct, that she's generally aware, but doesn't have a specific purchaser to present to you. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I would, and to find a purchaser for this property, it would take, it's a unique property, and so it takes a very concerted effort. It takes time in the day, and it takes targeting, it takes searching out who are those entities, what are those uses, what is permitted within single-family small lot, what are the organizations that could use this, and then how. And it could very well need to be more of a quilt where there are other tools used. I don't even know if they are possible there, but purchase of development rights, transfer of development rights, conservation easement on the forest. You know, this is a rather large place in Issaquah, and it seems to require a large effort, yeah, to find that future, to secure the future of the campus.
Then I have no other questions on other reasonable alternatives, and I am
Okay.
finished with the witness.
Okay, you've asked the questions you wanted to ask
Yes.
this witness. Okay, did you have any redirect you wanted to?
Just very briefly, Susan, Mr. Lell asked you, I'm sorry. Sorry. Susan, Mr. Lell, the city's attorney, asked you when the last time was that you visited the property. I think you said in 2015, and that was excluding the visit with Ms. Sewell in 2016. If the property were preserved, would you like to visit that property again?
I would love to visit that property. I would go there all the time to visit the property and watch the animals and walk around. I am absolutely desperate for a place like that to go. I stay in Issaquah and Sammamish pretty much all the time. I went to Bellingham a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago. Sometimes I go to Redmond. Like, that is such a special place to me. Yeah. I would absolutely go back if I could.
I think Mr. Farron asked you about Brixton Homes. Did you know that his reference? Did you know what that reference was in mention of?
An application for a housing development for 141 single-family homes
Gotcha.
on the almost 41 acres.
You turn to Exhibit A15,
Yeah.
paragraph 9.
Uh-huh.
This is a declaration of Troy Anderson, who I believe is the, I think it's the executive business pastor of Church Home, the church. And in paragraph 9, he's talking about Church Home having actually been marketing this property for, I believe, to home developers. And they actually had it under contract, but then it backed out and the deal fell through when the school district got involved with the condemnation proceeding. Do you know if Brixton Homes is the person that Mr. Anderson is referring to here?
Well, I seem to remember in the discovery documents, there were some documents that originated from the city about the Brixton Homes proposal. There was a notice of a neighborhood meeting, and I think that was in 2016, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, and Mr. Troy Anderson, as I understand it, he's the executive pastor and general counsel for Church Home. Yeah.
So I guess my one question is, after the school district basically froze everything by initiating the condemnation proceeding, are you aware of any home developers who have come in to try and develop this into something else? Like the Brixton Home type subdivisions?
No, I'm not aware of any. It sounds like from Church Home that that really cooled it on the market for them to have that Issaquah School District interest. It sounds like from verbally and also the discovery documents and, maybe declarations and motions. And I think that really changed things for them.
Are you aware of any evidence that would contradict Mr. Anderson's testimony that the condemnation proceeding basically scared away the home developers?
No, I'm not aware of anything like that.
No questions.
Okay.
Thank you for taking time today to be here and offer your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner.
You have another witness you want to call?
I do. I know I don't want to hit things up. Can we take like a 2-minute break? I just have to.
Yeah, let me check in too with the city. Do you know how long we have the hearing room today? Only until noon. Ah. Okay. Well, during the break then, we might review calendars as to another time to convene the hearing. And June 11th is reserved this hearing room. That might affect things. So yes, let's
Well, I
take.
can get to my next witness before then, but certainly, but I wasn't aware we were only here until noon.
Okay, we'll take the 5-minute break then. Okay, we're going to reconvene the hearing. And as we're doing so, I'm told that we can be in this room until 1, if that's agreeable to you. Okay. It'd be going through the lunch hour, but that's okay? All right. And then the reconvene on June 11th, we're trying to determine if that works on your calendars, and till 2 on the 11th. But right now, we'll continue with any witnesses the appellant wants to present, and after the next witness, we'll consider where we are in the timing of the day.
Okay. Thank you. And so May 11th works for me. I don't know if it does for anybody else.
June.
Can I call Lauren McCroskey?
Okay. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Please get comfortable there at the witness podium, and then I'll ask you to take the oath.
All right.
If you'd raise
I can take the oath.
your right hand. Do you swear to tell truth and testimony you give today?
I do.
Thank you.
Hi. Hi, Ms. McCroskey.
Hi.
Can you state your name and spell it for the record?
My name is Lauren McCroskey. I live at 1421 58th Way Southeast in Auburn.
Great. And what do you do for what's your background, Ms. McCroskey?
I'm an architectural historian by training. If you'd like my educational background.
Yeah, if we could, like a brief overview of your education and your
jump
training
ahead to that.
in historical significance and preservation.
Okay. Yes, I have an undergraduate degree in archaeology and have some graduate credits in archaeology as well. I hold a master's degree in historic preservation, emphasizing architectural history. And I have worked as the architectural historian, state architectural historian in 3 state historic preservation offices, including the state of Washington for 7 years. My current position is as senior architectural historian and program manager at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Technical Center of Expertise for the Preservation of Historic Buildings and Structures.
And do you have access to the appellant's exhibits from where you are?
I have some.
Do you have exhibit A1?
I believe I do. Just yes.
It says text written by Laura McCroskey and Jennifer Mortensen on Providence Heights College of Sister Formation.
Yes.
Can you tell me what that document is?
That document is a statement of the significance of the Providence Heights College. At the time, the intention was to seek a landmark listing for the property. The background makes a case for the architectural significance of the property, as well as the historical foundation of the Sisters Formation College and this very remarkable establishment of a college for the education, strictly for the education of sisters.
What date was it prepared?
This was prepared in 2016 to 17.
Well, was it published on a specific date, or?
Was this was the document that was submitted to get the landmark determination? Is that right?
Yes, it was. What I see here in this exhibit is pretty much the text from the landmark nomination form.
Let's see. So Sammamish Heritage Society submitted an application to the city to have the property designated as a historic landmark, correct?
Yes.
And this document essentially says why this property is historically significant.
Yes, it forms the foundation for that argument.
Okay, and it also says why you, I guess, but also Spanish Heritage Society thought that this property was deserving of historic landmark status, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could tell us, in your opinion, why this property is historically significant.
I think there's so many bases for significance for this property, it's sometimes hard to begin. When I initially visited the property and did some research on the architectural history of it, it became very clear that architectural and artistic significance was a very sound argument, really an overwhelming argument. The further I delved into the historic background of the whole building of this college and the reasons for its existence based on the Sisters of Providence and the really highly significant event in the 1950s of the Everett curriculum development by the sisters, which created for the first time ever an opportunity to establish a full collegiate academic training for sisters, which had never been provided in the history of the Catholic Church. So this was really a remarkable event and significant in a national perspective as well, beyond the local significance. I think...
So did I understand that correctly, that it has national historic significance in addition to local historic significance?
Yes, I would, based on my background in designating properties to the National Register of Historic Places, as well as working with local landmarks registers, I think this property is sort of a textbook case of a property that would be significant at the national level because of that association with the Sisters Formation College curriculum, which was created in the Everett curriculum and established here, and the college was built expressly for that purpose and is the only college of its kind in the country that was built under the guidelines and academic specifications of that curriculum.
So you had mentioned, so in addition to its place in history as part of that educational curriculum and that educational goal of the sisters, you had also mentioned the artistic significance as part of this. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. The college campus was initially the design work of a very prominent architect in this region, John Maloney. He initiated the design. He became very well known for his modernist work within commissions for the Catholic diocese in this area. This college is probably, it's his only example of a college campus. It's his only work. And the entire composition reflects probably some of the finest modernist ideals that you would find in this region and beyond. Specifically, the chapel, of course, has the remarkable colored windows, which were the work of a very important colored glass artist. You also have the remarkable thin-shelled concrete construction of the nave vault, which really shows the sophistication of the architects and engineers in their collaborative work here. Thin-shell concrete having been something that was coming into being around the world, but not used very many places. And then throughout the building organization, you have what really reflects sort of a medieval format and layout of a collegiate campus, but all sort of done in this modernist mode, which is really unique for the area and beyond. So, and I think also you have the finest materials. You have the sisters in their sophistication and their aspiration to create something that was really one of a kind, drew on the finest expertise they had available, including Mr. Maloney, the engineering firm that was used, as well as drawing in an internationally renowned glass artist, the finest architectural construction materials. Everything was top-notch. Everything was really a manifestation of their broad vision to create a very special place to educate the sisters.
Have you had a chance at all to review the environmental checklist in this case?
The environmental checklist, not specifically. No.
I wonder if do you have the city's exhibits up next to your?
C7.
Let's see. I think I'm missing a few pieces. Oh, okay. Great. Air. Let's see. Environmental.
What page would you like?
Well, I can direct her. I just wanted her to have a copy.
Exhibit C7 and on page 14.
Page 14. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Before I get to that, actually, I was curious. You talked about the buildings. And how many buildings are there? Do you know?
Oh, I'm sorry. Offhand, I can't recall. There's probably 8 to 15. I'm afraid I'm a little unclear in numbers.
That's fine if you don't know the exact number. In addition to the buildings, are you aware of the grounds, sort of the condition of the grounds, and if you could describe those?
Yes. I think a very important part of this whole concept was a place of retreat away from urban centers. There very clearly was a very strong natural environment surrounding the campus, which was integral to their mission. While the teaching and education took place in the buildings, there was very clearly a relationship with the surrounding landscape. I understand they had stations of the cross constructed. They had a little outdoor auditorium. They had camping experiences. So the landscape and the natural environment was very much integrated with their educational mission. So I think what we see today is a campus that still has a great amount of integrity and relationship between that natural setting and the buildings.
Right. Now, if I could turn you to page 14 of the SEPA checklist. Under heading 13, it says historic and cultural preservation. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The paragraph that starts in response to the April 16th SEPA environmental checklist submitted for the proposed Madison Point project at the site. It goes on to say DAHP, which is a state historical preservation organization or agency,
Right.
determined that the campus is eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places because of its use for the training of Catholic sisters and its architectural significance. Is that an accurate statement regarding this?
Yes, I would fully endorse that position, and having been the architectural historian in that same office, I believe that finding is entirely consistent with what I would view as significance, both architectural and historical importance.
And then it goes on, 2 paragraphs, it goes on to talk about how Sammamish Heritage Society submitted a landmark nomination for the campus in the sort of the next paragraph. And the paragraph following that, it goes on to talk about how the checklist makes the argument I believe that the landmarking of the landmarking of the site would violate church homes' constitutional rights. Okay. Are you familiar with the city of Issaquah's landmark preservation code?
I'm not specifically familiar there. I'm familiar with
Are you familiar with the general
compre-
construct that once a site is designated as a landmark specifically, then the applicant must go and ask permission from the Landmarks Commission for approval to alter any of the
Yes.
significant features.
Yes.
And in order to get that approval, they have to meet certain criteria.
Yes, I am familiar with that. Yep.
Yeah, sort of general concept stuff. If this site had not been listed, or if St. Sandwich Header Society had never submitted an application to actually have it landmarked as a historic landmark by the city, would that change your opinion as to whether or not this specific site is historically significant in a broader sense?
Absolutely not. Those of us who work in this field understand that there's a whole universe of highly significant historic properties that are either not listed because they're not known, or because there's some sort of private property objection. But for the work we do, listing and eligible is really it's the same status in terms of significance. Just because something is not listed in no way detracts from its eligibility for listing in either, say, the local landmark register or the National Register of Historic Places. So no, I feel it has does not in any way detract from the significance.
I'm going to read from you. This is a law, and it's WAC 19711, or 197-11-330 sub 3. Okay, this is a provision of the SEPA code, and it says a proposal may, to a significant degree, adversely affect environmentally sensitive or special areas, such as a loss or destruction of historic, scientific, and cultural resources.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion, based on your knowledge of this site and of this project, whether this project will in fact have a significant impact on historic, scientific, or cultural resources?
I absolutely do believe it would have an impact. The Providence Heights College is a remarkable asset for the community, for the state, and beyond. It has the potential, I think, to serve as an amazing model of the pursuit of excellence that women, in this particular case, accomplished, and something that they did at a time when women in their church were not normally allowed to pursue. So I think today we look at providing opportunities for young women and elementary school and beyond to learn about ways to achieve their fullest potential. I think we need those models. I think this is an amazing and tangible model right in front of us that can tell a story of how far women can achieve when they are given the opportunities. And in this case, something that was done sort of in a quiet way, but a really just remarkable way that can still serve as an example for women, for those who may be disadvantaged in other ways. I think it's just an incredible example of that. Beyond that, you have a set of buildings, a complex, and others here will speak much more eloquently to this, but buildings that are easily adaptable to other uses without incurring environmental damage and some of the other things that were just spoken of. These buildings are an asset. I think they're a resource without creating another carbon footprint, without, without introducing all kinds of unwanted hardscape and pavement into our landscape. We have far too much of that. I think this resource is just a very special resource that has so much to offer the city. It's a distinction for the city for its historic merit, for tourism potential, and in so many ways. So, could go on and on.
You use the word resource. That's the same word that the regulation I read to uses, historic resource. Would you consider the entire campus a historic resource?
Yes, absolutely. I believe that the entire campus is really the only way to understand this story of women who, however limited at the time in their capacity to achieve things that men in their church had already been given. I think it's definitely a resource, and I could not emphasize that more. It's an asset.
And then I just have one more question. Or actually, sorry, I don't just have one more question. On page 15 of the checklist, the one after the one I pointed you to earlier, if you look at sub D, it says propose measures to avoid, minimize, or compensate for loss, changes to, and disturbance to resources. This is the place, I believe, in the checklist where the applicant is to write down effectively if there are any mitigation measures to reduce the level of impacts. And there it says the stained glass windows in the existing church building will be preserved during demolition and given to the Sisters of Providence, which is the Catholic order that built the Providence Heights College campus on the site. In your opinion, because I believe you just testified that demolition of the buildings would have a significant impact on this particular historic resource. Is preserving the stained glass windows, in your opinion, sufficient mitigation to have the demolition no longer have a significant impact on this particular historic resource?
I would say no. However remarkable the windows are, and they are certainly the product of a world-renowned artist, the windows alone do not tell the story of the Sisters Formation movement. The windows alone do not communicate anything about the educational mission that they established. That story can only be told in the aggregate of buildings, of outbuildings, of classrooms, of dormitories, gymnasium facilities, in the natural setting that was very much integrated into their training. The entire complex is the story. The windows, yes, they're absolutely wonderful, spectacular, but I think to focus on the preservation of the windows alone does a great disservice to the memory of this women's, really a women's movement within the Catholic Church. Regardless of religious affiliation, it's a story of women advancing to their highest level and having an ability to fully participate for a short time in the church. So no, I think the windows are, frankly, would be unfortunate to preserve the work of a male artist and discard the entire record of women and what they accomplished there.
Just two more sets of questions. First is just to make sure you're aware of the words you're using. The term significant, I didn't define that for you, but just so you know, The word significant in SEPA, a significant impact is one that is more than a moderate impact. Would demolishing the campus property have more than a moderate impact on this historic resource? In addition to the city's landmark code, the one we were discussing earlier about requirements for alterations and going back to the landmarks commission, stuff like that, are you aware of any other like higher level rules, like say in the city's comprehensive plan, that also speak to preservation of historic resources?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind, let me pull out. Let's see. I can find it. Yes, I'm aware that in the city's comprehensive plan that addresses cultural resources and historic resource protection, there are standards that very much speak to this issue. It's all right if I read from these? I know they're
That'd be great.
in the
That's what I was hoping
exhibits.
for.
Okay. Historic resource protection, goal B is stated as protect historic resources to enhance the city's quality of life, unique sense of place, and economic vitality. This discussion follows historic community buildings, neighborhoods, and landscapes embody the intentions and lives of those who built them, lived or worked in them. They have stories to tell about what the community was and how it came to be, and help us understand who we are. Preserving these stories can be an important part of building a healthy community.
Let me stop you right there.
Yes.
Do you think the demolition of this property satisfies this goal of the comprehensive plan?
I don't believe it does. I believe it's entirely at odds with that goal. The goal as stated speaks to community buildings, structures, places, not museum artifacts. It speaks to the actual tangible buildings and places. So I think the removal of the campus, again, is at odds with the standards that have been laid out in the comp plan.
Thanks. I cut you off.
That's okay.
Were there others?
Let's see, I think there's one that's not cited in policy B, which states promote understanding and appreciation of Issaquah's treasures. And while the word treasure isn't really defined, I don't know if that's defined elsewhere in the comp plan. Treasures are often referred to as historic buildings and structures. In fact, we have a federal program called Save America's Treasures, and that program speaks specifically to the care and preservation of buildings, structures, objects, places, archaeological sites, but not to museum artifacts, places.
Seed policy B2 also says provide space for arts, culture, and heritage organizations to inform and engage the public with displays and exhibitions that reflect Issaquah's character, treasures, and sense of place. It's another sort of lofty goal, but is demolition consistent with that, in your opinion?
I would say no. Demolition would remove that opportunity, would take away the spaces in this complex of buildings that tell us that story, is referring back to the discussion of in the code, telling stories and understanding the lives of who built and lived in these places. So no, I believe removing the buildings and the campus complex as a whole would take away that opportunity.
And then last, C policy B3 says support efforts to secure space for the preservation of Issaquah's physical heritage. Do you think this site is part of Issaquah's physical heritage?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's one of the most it's a very large parcel, large campus. It's a dominant feature of distinction, and I think it's very much physical heritage. Again, beyond a set of windows, it is a place. It is a complex with stories to tell, and that can really only be told in the survival of the buildings.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you feel is important for the hearing examiner to know about the historical significance of this place that's going to be demolished?
Well, there's so many. I think for those of us who have lived in this area for some time, and many of you a lot longer than I have, this property is it's a slice of what Puget Sound used to be. We have so few places anywhere that tell that story, that show us how people could select a fine piece of land and carve out something special. And I think historically that's also an important aspect. This is a part of our land use history that gives us a gauge of where we have been and how far we have come. And I think without those measuring sticks and without those tangible places, I don't know where we go from here. This region is, I'm sure as everybody would agree, it's changing so fast that it's barely recognizable. We don't have any touchstones to our past. We have a few, but they're disappearing. This is a place to connect. This is a place to understand where we've been and who we've been in the past, and to measure that against our future. So.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Okay. Mr. Lell, do you have any questions on behalf of the city?
Yes, Mr. Examiner, thank you. Very
Proceed.
briefly. Ms. McCroskey, I have a few questions just to follow up on your testimony, please.
Sure.
First of all, if I understood you correctly, you stated that in your opinion, the entire Providence Heights campus, inclusive of all of its buildings, its infrastructure, and everything else on the site, is in its entirety a historically significant or culturally significant resource. Is that your position?
Yes.
If that's the case, is there, in your opinion, an ability to protect or preserve that culturally significant or historically significant resource, except to prevent the demolition of the building?
Oh, absolutely. In my work, I have been aware of a number of projects locally, nationally, that have very successfully, adaptively reused buildings of this type. This campus has many pluses in its favor in that aspect, in that the buildings are fairly simple, elegantly simple, and with volumes that could easily be adapted. I think if there were every effort taken, a collaborative, cooperative effort to seek out other opportunities to reuse these buildings, I think at this point there's somewhat of an unknown about that. I think there's a demonstrated interest, but I think there needs to be more of a coordinated effort to seek out ways these buildings could be reused.
And if the demolition of the campus buildings were to proceed, what, in your view, would be an appropriate mitigation measure for that?
Well, mitigation can take many forms, although in matters of historic preservation, place and authenticity are key. And once you have lost that, you've lost the resource. So mitigation in this sense, I think that's something that would need to be discussed at this time. I think because they are so easily adaptable and such an incredible resource, I think every avenue should be explored and exhausted to make sure that that can't happen. And I don't feel right now that there's evidence that that can't happen.
Thank you. I'd like to turn your attention to the provisions of the city's comprehensive plan cultural element that I believe you cited and discussed during your direct testimony. First of all, I think if memory serves, you referred to these as standards. Is it your position that these are actually regulatory standards as opposed to simply goals or policies?
I have to say, my familiarity with the comprehensive code is not what yours is, and if I've used the term standard, perhaps that goal, I'm not sure, perhaps you could clarify that. I don't know what the term would be. Is there a term?
I was just asking whether or not that you felt that the cited goals and policies that were discussed in your testimony actually had binding regulatory effect. That's typically how the word standard is used in that context. But if I'm hearing you correctly, that wasn't your intent?
I think goals and standards, that's a term that you might want to debate. I think a goal is something, if any municipality establishes goals, those are viewed as something that should be accomplished. Whether that's a regulatory terminology, I couldn't speak to that.
Thank you. And I think you just testified that you weren't as familiar perhaps with the city's comprehensive plan. Is that an accurate statement?
I am familiar in just a general way.
Okay. And turning your attention to C policy B1 under historic resource protection goal B, which was part of your testimony, there was some attention given to the term used in quotation marks there, Issaquah's treasures. And I believe that you testified that you didn't know what that really meant or whether or not that term had been defined elsewhere in the city of Issaquah's comprehensive plan. Is that correct?
It's a catch-all term. Maybe you would like to explain how that's defined.
So would it surprise you, or are you unaware that the city does in fact have a treasures list elsewhere in its comprehensive plan where the historic and cultural resources that the City Council of Issaquah has deemed historically or culturally significant have been actually designated and listed? Are you aware of that?
I'm generally aware that that's true with most local governments that have a cultural or preservation program. However, I'm also very aware that all communities recognize that the body of treasures or significant buildings is a big universe, and that not everything that has been listed in some kind of format is actually significant, that there are great numbers of historic resources that simply have not been designated or become part of a treasures list. But that in no way negates their importance.
Thank you. And just to clarify, are you aware that the City of Issaquah's comprehensive plan treasures list does not include a reference to the Providence Heights campus?
I am not aware of that, but I would not be surprised in that, as I've said, many communities do not call out every single significant building complex site simply because they have not all been fully either landmarked or designated. But those lists are small and limited and do not, again, represent the body of what's out there that's important.
Mr. Law, could you identify what list you're referring to? Is that in an ordinance or
the
part of the comp plan?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, this is the treasures list in the City of Issaquah's comprehensive plan. We will be providing citation to that during Mr. Niven's
In the comprehensive plan, okay.
testimony. And thank you, Ms. McCroskey. I have no further questions. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you.
Okay, applicant have questions for this witness?
I'll keep them brief.
Please proceed.
So, Ms. McCroskey, just two brief sets of questions. First, to follow on Mr. Lell's question about listing it on the Issaquah's comprehensive plan, I want to ask you about other places where an historic site might be shown. Are you familiar with the Washington Information System for Architectural and Archaeological Records Data?
Yes.
WISARD, I think they
Yes.
call it. And do you know that the Providence Heights campus does not appear on the WISARD map?
I'm aware that there are a lot of things that do not appear on the Wizard map, and I'm also aware that the Wizard database system is presently underfunded and unable to fully incorporate the most recent data. So I think staff would fully acknowledge that everything in that Wizard database at the moment does not convey everything that is significant.
So it doesn't include the Providence Heights campus, insofar as you know?
I personally am not aware of that.
All right. And a couple of questions on Mr. Maloney, the architect. So Mr. Maloney designed a number of buildings at Central Washington University, Yakima Valley College, Washington State University, Seattle University, Gonzaga University, and other places, other colleges. Are you aware of that?
Is that in the record? I'm going to object.
I'm just asking the witness if she knows.
You stated as a fact, you asked if she was aware.
You've got an objection, so don't answer quite yet. Were you providing testimony there, Mr. Farron, or
No, I'm
what's that
asking-
loose? That,
I'm asking if she's aware of other colleges that Mr. Maloney.
okay, more general, not that
Correct.
they do exist, but are you aware of any that exist anywhere
correct.
else on other campuses?
You'd like me to answer?
Yeah, if you're aware of any.
I'm
other
aware of
ones.
Mr. Maloney's work throughout the state, having designed individual buildings. The buildings referenced are not college campuses, but individual buildings. The Providence Heights campus is the only example of his work of this type. He has, of course, designed individual buildings, yes.
Okay. A real specific question here. None of the college buildings that Mr. Maloney designed are actually listed on the National Register for Historic Properties. Is that correct?
I honestly am not, I'm not currently familiar with the listing status of all of his properties. But again, I would restate that there are numerous properties listed that are not listed in the national or local register simply because it hasn't happened. You might find it interesting to know that as recently as 3 years ago, Arlington National Cemetery was not listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It's a little different example, but it's simply a fact that in this field, properties don't always get listed until there's a reason for listing or there's some activity or funding or expertise available to do so.
All right. I'm going to ask you a few questions about mitigation. You testified that the history here can really only be told in the survival of the building. That's what I took down in my notes. Is that correct? That's what you said?
Yes.
All right. Were you aware that the history of the Sisters Formation movement and this campus are reflected in documentation archived and maintained by the Sisters of Providence?
Oh, yes. In fact, a lot of that material I researched for this effort. Mitigation these days in the preservation world is regarded as something beyond mere documentation. The information you've described would almost never be consulted by the general public, would not be available without an appointment or, first of all, being even aware that it existed. These are very exclusive places, and hard documentation is not really these days regarded as full mitigation in any way for the loss of significant resources.
Do you know how much documentation there is at Providence St. Joseph Health?
Yes.
Regarding
yes,
this property?
Yes, we, Jennifer, I'm sorry, my colleague and I did review, and we did go to that archive and looked at all the evidence.
No other questions? Thank you.
Any redirect?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Lell asked you some questions about the differences between standards, goals, and policies. And I take it you're not familiar with that terminology, right? You're not familiar with the distinctions between those things, goals, standards, and policies?
Generally, yes. I was speaking to the Issaquah comp plan.
That's fine.
Yeah.
If I told you I had a policy to never smoke tobacco, and then you saw me smoking tobacco, would you think I was acting inconsistent with my policy?
Yes.
If I told you I had a goal to never smoke tobacco, and then you saw me smoking tobacco, would I be acting inconsistent with my goal?
Yes.
Mr. Lell asked you about a list of treasures that were listed. We haven't seen it. Mr. Lell hasn't provided it. But in your opinion, if you were to find out that this list was not on a list called treasures, approved by the city council as part of the comprehensive plan, would that change your opinion as to how historically significant this resource is?
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
You said, Mr. Lell also asked you, and I think Mr. Farron did also, about mitigation. I think Mr. Lell asked you what would be appropriate mitigation, and then Mr. Farron asked you if you were aware of how much documentation was in an archive. Did you understand what Mr. Lell was talking about when he used the phrase appropriate mitigation? What was your understanding of that?
Well, appropriate mitigation, I think that's probably a term we could debate. Appropriate mitigation would be something that would be reached in a consensus, I assume. Appropriate is, I think we'd have to look to, if it exists in the comp plan or in the city's historic preservation ordinance, what kinds of mitigation would be considered appropriate. I don't think there's been any, I don't think appropriate has been established at this point.
And I guess what I'm getting at is, we're here to talk about whether or not there's going to be a significant impact.
Right.
And maybe there's mitigation, maybe there's not. Maybe there's a lot of mitigation, maybe there's not. I guess what I'm wondering is, no matter how much documentation there is,
Right.
Whether it's listed as a treasure, whether any other sort of mitigation like that, is destroying the place still a significant impact on this particular historic resource?
Absolutely. Restoring it removes all of that tangible physical evidence that can be understood by the public and those who might visit or use these buildings. It would be a complete obliteration, and just having something documented in an archive that is almost never accessed would certainly not be considered mitigation in my mind.
Right. So experiencing the place is different than reading about it in a book.
Absolutely, yes.
I'd like to ask a question along those lines of you. And what we're here to look at, you've been clear about, you consider demolition the significant impact on the historic value of the campus. I think the questions being asked are, what might there be mitigation that would reduce that impact below a significant impact? That's more of the legal test. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but is there any mitigation that would reduce the impact below a level of significance?
Well, I think that level of mitigation that would be appropriate in this case would be a full consideration of alternatives to reuse and adaptively reuse these buildings in the campus and landscape. That would be mitigation in I don't know if it's appropriate necessarily, but in parlance of the National Historic Preservation Act, upon which the Issaquah Landmarks program is based, there's something called mitigation of adverse effect, and that can be done through redesign of a building, of a structure, of a campus, looking at alternatives to demolition. So in my mind, that's the most appropriate mitigation in this case, at least a full exploration of all alternatives to have these buildings continue in a usable state and as an asset to the community.
Thank you. And can you share what has happened? What's the process? How long a period do you allow? When do you understand if that can or cannot happen?
I can say there really is no hard and fast rule for a time period. That time period might be established in this body. I don't really know how that would be established, but normally there would need to be an examination of all possible alternatives, trying to engage the public, advertising, giving the property its due diligence and its opportunity to gain interest and engage prospective developers. I think that's something that, to my mind, has not happened here, and I see that is a mitigating action, fully exploring alternatives. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, thank you. You did, and if I opened up an area, please ask questions about what I ask about if you'd like to.
If your sole goal is to demolish the place, and that's what we limit our focus to, it's hard to think of alternatives that would accomplish the goal of demolishing it that don't have a significant impact, right?
I'm sorry, could you?
I mean, if the goal is to demolish the place and we're asking for alternative ways of doing that, that would not result in significant impact, it's pretty hard to think of a mitigation that'd be sufficient. Is that how it strikes you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if the goal was in fact, if it turns out that demolition is really just part and parcel of the school district's plan to build a school or to build something else there, then you might be able to think of mitigation, right? You might be able to think of different ways of using the place, correct?
Absolutely. It's been pretty stunning to me, the idea that a contemporary school could not be fitted into this campus. Buildings that are far more, I guess, complex or less adaptable have been adapted for all kinds of uses. This is not as complicated. These are large volumes, rectangular, square volumes, open volumes that have a lot of flexibility. So, yes.
Yeah. Do you know enough about the Issaquah Historic Landmarks Code to know whether or not the church, I'm sorry, not the church, the school district, with no First Amendment rights similar to the church in this case, would just a school district likely be allowed to come in and say, we're going to demolish this place and build a brand new school, totally different? Do you know enough about it to be able to opine on that issue?
I'm not sure I do have that perspective. I do believe under the state code, there is a requirement in the checklist to look at alternatives, especially if a government entity is looking to demolish a property.
You said the checklist.
I believe that's part of the SEPA checklist.
I was talking about the landmarks code, the City of Issaquah landmarks code with the certificate of appropriateness process, where you go to the Landmarks Commission if you want to alter a historical resource. What I was wondering is, do you know enough about that particular code, the landmarks code, to know whether or not the school district, like suppose Church Home were to say, that's it, we're not going to demolish it, we're going to let the school district just take it. Would the school district, do you know enough to say whether they could come in and say, all right, now we're going to demolish it, and we're going to get approval from the Landmarks Commission? Do you think they could do that?
I don't believe they could. Again, I'm not, they would not be able to do that without a review process through the local commission. Yeah.
Thank you. I have nothing more.
Okay, thank you for being here and for your testimony. It's now noon. We have another hour. Do you want to proceed with another witness, or should we check in? How many more additional witnesses would you want to call, Mr. Townsend?
I'm just looking at my list. I have 5 more witnesses, but that includes Mr. Niven, who is also a city witness. And I know one of mine should be pretty short, at least. But I think even that all took less than an hour, I think we can proceed and do more. Or actually, you stay. Yeah.
Who else do we have? Friend, my dad. Friend, my dad.
Let's do your dad. Michael Hass, if I could.
I'm not sick, but I could be.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Can you get comfortable there?
I'll try. Yes,
Okay, and once you are, I'll ask you to raise your right hand and take the oath, please. You swear to tell truth, the testimony you give today.
I do.
Thank you.
Hi. Could you state and spell your name for the record?
George Michael Hass, H-A-S-S.
And are you related to Susan, who's been sitting here next to me?
Yes, she's my daughter, one of my 2 daughters.
Where do you live, Mr. Hass?
19524 Southeast 24th Place in Sammamish.
And is that anywhere near Providence Heights campus?
Relatively close, probably, 2 miles?
Susan, your daughter, had testified earlier to her having used the property. Have you ever visited the property or enjoyed it?
I have not. I've driven past it, down the hill, down that awful hill.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do for a living, what you used to do, and your education?
Okay, education. I have a master or a Bachelor of Arts degree in chemistry from Northwestern University of Evanston, Illinois. PhD in biochemistry from Duke University, Durham, North Carolina. Postdoctoral training in biochemistry from University of Washington. I taught for 7 years and did research, sorry about the did research in protein biochemistry at the University of Idaho. And then I worked at Abbott Laboratories in North Chicago, Illinois, doing some work in, all the work was in the cancer diagnostics area, and that generated a lot of my interest in this report related to PCBs. And some of my research there was in the quality assurance area, in the cancer diagnostics area. I was there for 13 years, and then I left, returned to Seattle, and worked as vice president of research and development for bar diagnostics, and then various other things of less interest to this group. If we want to end in an hour, do you have a bottle of water, somebody, Susie? So I've had experience both in R&D, cancer diagnostics, and in quality.
Okay.
I'm here primarily because Mr. Culver couldn't make it, and I was interested particularly in his comments about PCBs associated with the site, the Providence Heights site. Particularly concerned by his comments about the PCBs. And I was annoyed by his sort of wishy-washy statement about may be present there. PCBs may be present there. Maybe is something that we would, kind of not worry about so much. Fortunately, what's the name of that company? Agros.
You're referring to
Arcos?
The report, yeah. The report we've been looking at,
Yes, helped us a lot because they changed that maybe to PCBs are associated with the site. And PCBs are, as we know, carcinogens. Am I extending into the next area of questioning?
You're doing great.
Okay.
I was trying to guide you along, but I was basically going to ask you, what was your interest in the PCB issue, and do you have an opinion on whether there's like a risk to human health or a likely risk, and for you to elaborate on the basis for your opinion. So if you want to just carry it forward and speak to those issues.
Well, why don't I do that? Things will move along maybe a little faster.
Sure.
Do I have an opinion about the risk of PCBs? The EPA has a fairly significant opinion about the PCBs. The water level allowed by the EPA on PCBs is technically 0, but you can't detect technically 0, can you? That's a meaningless level. So they set it at what a detectable level is, and that's 0.5 parts per billion of PCBs. So if there are PCBs in the environment up there, it would be very nice to know that. It would be very nice to have a very thorough examination of the property, of the groundwater, of anything that's removed there by a company that's competent to do that examination, by a company that's trained to do that examination and removal. I read the website of Rhine. There's no indication on his website, on their website, that they do anything beyond lead removal and asbestos. They don't mention PCBs. What are PCBs anyway? I didn't even.
Can I stop you on just for this? The examiner knows you referenced Rhine. Could you
Rhine,
explain for the examiner
R-H-I-N-E.
who Rhine is?
Rhine is the contractor that's, I think it's in here somewhere.
we looked at
Oh,
that
here it
report
is.
earlier,
It's
it's the
Exhibit
cleanup
C8.
plan.
C8.
C8, thank you.
I think my daughter, Susan, mentioned them, and she took a lot of my thunder away. So I'll have a little talk with her later. My glasses are screwed up. As far as I can tell, Ryan isn't qualified to remove containing materials, nor are they qualified to test for PCB containing materials. PCBs are really wonderful compounds. They were made, until they were determined to be not really wonderful compounds. They're widely associated with and incorporated in as resistors, because of their fact that they're not flammable, because they're great protectors against electrical materials. And so there are 6 of these sitting up at Providence Heights in the site. There's no evidence that I could tell from any of these. Perhaps the lawyers for Church Home will be able to clarify this a little for me. There's no evidence that there's any removal process for removing what are they called?
The transformers.
Transformers. Excuse me, sir. From the site, there's no evidence for testing the land around there. PCBs don't just wash away with rain. They're very resistant to decay. They're very resistant to biotransformation. In other words, when they get into the environment, they stick there. When they get into us, they stick there. They cause, in us, they're known to be carcinogens by the EPA. They're known to cause all kinds of immunological effects, hormonal effects. They're particularly dangerous for women who are pregnant or choose to become pregnant. They move up the food chain. PCBs, how do they get in the environment? By companies inadvertently making mistakes by hiring people to remove PCB containing materials that aren't trained to do it, that aren't trained to test for PCBs. Testing for PCBs is a difficult process and an expensive process. You've got to test the land. You've got to test soil samples. It's not as simple as testing for asbestos or lead, which is very straightforward. So when this company begins to remove these fairly large, again, what are they?
Transformers.
Transformers, sorry. My credibility is gone
It's a way to
now.
keep people listening. I get you. I know what you're doing.
Yeah, it helps to have a little sleep before you come to these. You really want somebody that's trained to do it, that knows how to test, to do sampling, appropriate sampling of the area, testing the materials then. You don't want to make those people sick because they are contaminated themselves. You don't want to make school children sick in the playgrounds that are incorporated around there. You don't want Church Home to get sued later because they find, oh my gosh, we should have known that there were PCBs in that area, and now nobody wants our land for anything. And I just don't think there's anything that I've seen in this plan that says we prepared adequately for PCB removal and testing. I don't think Rhine says anything in their job description or in their work plan that says anything except small amounts of PCBs and fluorescent light ballasts, which are really very small amounts. If you think this is kind of a joke, it really isn't. They're small molecules, they're hydrophobic, which means they hate water, They get washed down, flushed down, not washed down. They don't dissolve. They don't go away. They get contaminated. Lake Washington, you know how many perch you're supposed to eat if you catch them in Lake Washington? I think it's one a month, one a week, no more than that. I didn't know it. They're pretty tasty. But they're contaminated with PCBs. And the state of Washington says don't eat them. And Lake Washington's a pristine lake. There's nothing, there are no restrictions in Lake Sammamish, but there might be. I can draw you structures of PCBs. I've dealt with worse carcinogens than PCBs before. So I can tell you all about how many different forms PCBs take, but I think that would just be boring and wouldn't be helpful at this point.
Well, let's see if your attorney has some more specific questions for this witness.
Mr. Hess, do you have a copy of our exhibits with you up there?
Of which,
Yeah, he has that one. And
Um,
the letter from James Colbert. So he has any type.
Do you have Exhibit A10? That is, it's an EPA document called Learn About PCBs.
ATM, yes.
So the first page talks about PCBs manufacturing being banned in 1979, right?
Yes.
But there's still a threat. I understand that they can be locked inside of transformers or something like
Yes,
that.
or they can leak out also.
Exactly. Once they get out, do they stay in the environment for a long time? Correct.
A long time.
And then it goes on page 2 of that document. It says today, PCBs can still be released into the environment from poorly maintained hazardous waste sites, and it lists some other things. And then it says specifically leaks or releases from electrical transformers containing PCBs. And that's one of five things that EPA chose to list here.
Yes.
Do you have, I think you had mentioned you had worked on sort of safe handling instructions with your time. Was it at Abbott Laboratories?
Yes, we used, I was in the diagnostics division, and we used a lot of quite dangerous chemicals, radioactive materials, mercury-containing materials, thimerosal.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, how easy is it to have a release of PCBs into the environment? I mean, if the transformers were cracked or something like that, would that be enough to be suspicious that there might be a release, or does it take more work to actually have a release of PCBs?
PCBs are kind of tricky. It's a generic term for a whole family of molecules. Some are fairly fluid, and so I don't know what the specifics are in these specific ones are in these transformers. Some are fairly fluid. They have small amounts of C, which is the chlorine, Cl, associated with them. Others are very viscous, almost gel-like. It'd be more difficult to flow out if the transformer was split open. Anyway, you don't want to take a chance with them. You want to make sure that you're trained. You want to make sure that the person that's removing it is trained. I was also concerned when I glanced through this, and again, Mr. Culver should be here and not me. I was concerned about one statement that says that contaminated materials would be shipped out in a truck. Non-contaminated materials would be shipped out in a separate truck. but those trucks would not be decontaminated, and so there could be a switch of trucks. When one truck comes back, it could have contained a contaminated material going down, coming up. Going down the next time, it could have a non-contaminated material. It doesn't matter much because they're not testing for them anyway. They wouldn't know if they're contaminated.
So let me ask you this. It seems like the tenor of your testimony so far and of our conversation has been focused on whether or not there might be a future release of PCBs into the environment during the demolition process. But do you have an opinion on whether or not there could have already been a release from this site since they've been present?
I have no idea.
Have you seen in the documents that you have reviewed? I take it you reviewed the Argus report. I think you reviewed a checklist and I think it was the demolition plan or the waste plan. In the documents you saw, did you see any indication that there had been any testing on site to determine if soils or anything else on site had been contaminated with PCBs?
No. Again, it's a very sophisticated assay to do that testing. I have no idea whether this company could do it. I rather doubt that Ryan can, or else they probably would have specified that they could do the testing.
But it can be done.
It can be done.
Now assume, so if there had been a past release, right, and there were still, I guess, free PCBs on the site, could that pose a health risk for anybody using the site in the future?
I'm not an environmental scientist, but I would certainly propose that the site undergo a very thorough screening and testing to make sure that there was no material there. And I would certainly assume that whoever purchased and reused the site would ensure that once the materials were removed that contained PCBs, that area was very thoroughly sampled and tested by state-of-the-art methods. Again, 0 parts per billion is the accepted level of PCB contamination.
Now, going back to the demolition part, I know you talked, so the PCBs have different sort of physical or chemical properties depending on how much C is involved. Some are viscous, some are more fluid. But I think you testified generally earlier that they're pretty sticky. They cling to you. If there were a mishap where somebody got, I don't know, PCBs on their shoes or their gloves or a piece of equipment that was then trotted around the rest of the demolition site, could the PCBs basically be spread across the site in that way?
Yes.
And that would increase the contamination or the threat level for people down the road.
It could.
I mean, it could. It's conceivable.
Yeah. Initially, they were noted as a problem. You're rubbing your hand because people would rub their hands because it passes. Yeah, you touched the transformer. It passes through the skin, and it kind of localizes in the liver and in the bladder. And one of the assays I developed was for bladder cancer, and that's a disease you don't want to get, or liver cancer.
So your daughter Susan told me I should ask you about carcinogenesis. What is carcinogenesis?
Carcinogenesis is basically the development of cancer as precipitated by a molecule.
A molecule precipitated by
a kind of molecule, a type, any number of ways or radiation, the sun can disrupt the genetic structure that we have. So PCBs, nobody really understands why they're carcinogenic, how they work. I can look at them and I can look at a structure of PCB and I can say, well, it could work by being an intercalator, by binding to the clefts between DNA bases going up the molecule and screwing things up, or it looks like a hormone, so it messes up hormone receptors, and that's likely because hormonal effects are known to be a problem for PCBs, but nobody really knows. They just know it causes cancer.
Okay, appreciate your testimony. I want to give an opportunity for cross-examination of this witness. Have you completed your direct exam?
I was going to tell him, unless he has more to add, I didn't have any more.
Okay, thank you. So does the city have any questions for Mr. Haas?
2 or 3 follow-up questions, Mr. Examiner. Thank you. Mr. Haas, just to clarify what I understood your testimony to be, you live approximately 2 miles from the Providence Heights campus, but if I understood you correctly, although you drive by it, you've never actually personally visited the site.
That's correct.
Okay. And in preparation for your testimony today, I think that you or your attorney had indicated that you had reviewed the Rhine company website, the Argus report, the environmental checklist. Did you review any other documents for today's proceeding?
Well, the EPA, yeah, the Rhine management plan, the EPA.
Thank you. And final question, is it your understanding that the regulatory framework for PCBs is primarily at the local or municipal level, or is that something that is typically within the regulatory purview of the state?
It's my understanding that it's a federal.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Federal regulation.
Thank you, sir.
Applicant
Yes.
attorney, Mr. Farron?
Are you familiar with the regulations governing the disposal of PCBs?
PCBs?
Correct.
Am I familiar with? No.
Okay. Then I have no other questions.
I'm sorry, your question was familiar with disposal of PCBs? Disposal regulations. Okay.
I can certainly speculate.
Yeah, well, I don't think you testified about disposal. It was about the existence on the site and the carcinogenic aspects. So-
Yes, and I also suggested, sir, that whoever's doing the disposing should be trained, and the site should be tested before and after.
Right.
And there are also regulations that involve manifesting.
Yeah, that's okay. You
Okay.
don't need to be an expert on everything. So, yeah, disposal is outside that realm, and that's
Okay.
fine. I thank you for being here, sir, and for offering your testimony.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for your presence.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I guess I'm making an effort here to squeeze in as many as possible. If you're comfortable doing that, Mr. Telligen, you may have another witness you want to present, or you want to take a minute to consider that.
I'd like to take just 1 minute. if I
Yeah.
could.
About school linkage, anything else?
I guess I'm in a bit of a bind. I think actually the rest of my witnesses will take some time, and one of them is Mr. Niven. So I don't know, do we want to proceed or just reconvene on the 11th?
Well, I'd like to get a better sense of where the hearing might go, and you've been very cooperative in identifying that you had, I think, 5 additional and then presented one, and the, initial list were 9 witnesses. Has that been maybe narrowed down a little bit? And that's fine if you've done that. I expect that to happen.
Yeah, so our original witness list had 9. Catherine Rogers Merlino will not be able to testify. Susan McGill will not be able to testify. James Culver was not going to be able to testify, but now that we have a future date opening up, I'm presuming he may.
Same with those two. I don't know if they'd be able to.
Oh, really?
I was waiting.
We actually may be able to have a full witness, because all of our taking them off was due to their schedules. So now that we can actually go beyond, we will have to reassess, but then that will also mean that, frankly, we may not call people that I had scheduled for today as people who were going to speak because they wouldn't be able to be here.
Well, it's a challenge. I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position, but we also have 10 witnesses listed by the applicant,
Right.
number by the city, so I'm trying to get an idea of the amount of time we might need for hearing. And it's governed somewhat by presentation of your witnesses and on what areas of expertise that they would testify about.
Right. So I do have one short witness that maybe we could go for now. After that, the witnesses that I know I will be calling after this witness, I would think would take up about 2 more hours of time. But then I don't know, for example, if James Culver, Catherine Rogers Merlino, or Susan McGrill could actually come at a later date.
Okay.
But of the ones that I know, I can put on one now, and then the rest of them will probably be about 2 hours the next time we convene.
Okay.
So
I think we should.
I'd call in Francis Pope. I guess
Yep, let's proceed with that. Good afternoon to you. You might be able to pull that microphone down a little bit. There it
You said
is.
short witness, that's, is
Yeah.
this on?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
working, that's
Okay,
working
thank
very
you.
well.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you to first take the oath, and then we'll get your testimony on the record. Please raise your hand, and do you swear or affirm to tell truth in testimony you give today?
I do.
Thank you.
So Ms. Pope, you didn't just spell your name, did you? Could you spell your name for the record?
Oh, Frances with an E, Frances, Pope, P as in Paul, O-P-E.
Great. Where do you live?
I live at 625 Mount Fury Circle Southwest, Issaquah, Washington. I've been a resident for 45 years. I have no personal financial interest in Providence Heights.
So, Ms. Pope, I know that you had prepared some materials to keep track of your testimony today. And frankly, the last testimony went pretty good with Mr. Hass just sort of speaking. Would you like to just tell the examiner sort of the issues you have with this particular project, with the MDNS, where you think it's lacking, and whether you think there's going to be significant impacts?
Okay, a little bit of background. I'm employed by King County Library System as a substitute librarian, have a BA in English from The Ohio State University and Master of Arts in Library Science from University of Michigan. And to assure transparency, I'm a member of Sammamish Symphony, where I play second violin and serve as secretary of the board. I'm also a violinist with Kirkland Civic Orchestra. Both are community orchestras. I am vice president of Preserve Providence Heights. For the purposes of this hearing, I am not representing either the King County Library System or Sammamish Symphony in any official capacity. Rather, I'm drawing from those experiences to explain my support for, for the Preserving Providence Heights campus and to have it be the best possible use for the larger community of social and cultural benefit. I have never been a member of Sammamish Heritage Society. As for the MDNS, I have been very concerned that the process has been neither thorough nor realistic. I first heard of the threat to Providence Heights by accessing the Washington Historical Web of threatened properties. Shortly after that, over 2 years ago, I started a change.org petition asking for signatures of those who wish to save the property. To date, there are 585 signatures from local, state, national, and international people. These were updated and submitted several times to the city and also to the Issaquah School District 411. I asked the District 411 for a response and received none. I've written letters as well that were not acknowledged, and I feel those signatures speak to negate the non-significant status, but the wishes of the citizens have been ignored in the determination.
And I appreciate your testimony, and I think I know where you're going. I want to offer you, too, that I do consider written testimony, if you have it, because it appears to me you're reading.
I'm reading it,
Yeah.
I can submit
You could
that to
submit
you.
it, and I promise you, I do read the written submittal.
Okay, would that move things along? Would that
Well,
be?
it certainly would.
The only problem is I'd be just fine with that, but I think what she's reading actually has questions. I'm a little bit, could she go back and basically take out the questions that are written in there and just make it into a narrative and submit it for everybody to read?
Yes, that would be fine with me. I don't think anyone would object to that. And I want to make certain it's within the scope of the hearing as to her testimony is related to the challenge that the MDNS was not properly issued.
100%, yes.
It wasn't 100% because I was hearing about petitions and people that might be opposed, and that's not something I really want to consider.
I guess I felt that was a bit of introductory remarks, giving context to her comments.
Okay, well, let's get, you're able to place it in a written form that you're comfortable submitting, and then we'll have you on the record with the testimony you want to present today.
Okay,
And I'll read it, and others will read it. If they have questions of you after they read the testimony, they'll be able to ask that at the next hearing. Can you come to that next hearing on June 11th?
that's next Monday?
Week from today.
I think so.
Well, that'd be good,
Okay.
because then we'll take it in writing and allow people to read it and respond at that time. Is that all right?
No objection from the city if she
Great.
will be here for purposes of cross-examination at the reconvened hearing.
She indicated she would. It's all right, Mr. Farron, too. Great, thank you.
Okay.
That will really help all of us.
Okay, now, do you want me to submit this to
I think,
you or to my
work
attorney?
with your attorney on that.
Okay.
He's going to have you reword some of it, I think.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, with that being the case, I don't like to eat up time, but it might just be best for us to break.
Yeah, unless there's someone here you want to present that can't be here next time.
I don't believe so.
She was kind of far away.
Yeah, I think I'd rather just wait till next time.
Okay. Well, then, it's 12:35. I do apologize for the short time frame we have in the hearing room. I wasn't certain about that, but that's the way things are here in the city of Issaquah. I guess next Monday, we'd have the hearing room until about the same time, 1?
Yeah, we can go till 2 on Monday, if that works for everybody. And then why don't we go ahead and poll our calendars in between now and next Monday to see if there's a third meeting time that we can set up in the meantime?
Not sure we really want to plan for that, because I've heard about 2 hours.
Well, so I had said 2 hours for the two other witnesses that I was going to call. But that also, if this remained again, the problem is that may free up 3 witnesses who couldn't be here today. So I will try and be as quick as possible, but it's a little bit in flux right now.
Did you have another date that would work for this hearing room?
I'll ask the clerk to maybe send out some available dates to all the parties, and we can set up a third, assuming, because I don't see us being done in one more half day.
Well, it depends on a lot of factors, and if there are witnesses like Ms. Pope that have testimony that could be circulated in writing, that is one way to do it.
Yeah,
You're
that's
familiar
what,
with the
actually, I'm thinking that since you're amenable to that, I may poll my witnesses to see how many of us can provide written comments and then be here for cross and redirect.
I think that's a helpful way to move forward with what we might characterize as citizen appeal. You have a number of citizens involved in an organization that would like to present testimony.
Right.
And that's an effective way of doing it. If you get that a couple days in advance as city council and applicant council, and they're nodding their approval, so you might consider that method. Okay? Everyone's fine with that.
Okay.
A couple days ahead of time. So if it, even on Thursday, if there's written statements prepared and circulated by email, that would be helpful, and then they could be here if there's any cross-examination questions.
Right. I guess it's no guarantee, but I will certainly pull everybody and see.
We're just looking for ways to facilitate you moving forward with the appeal, and I appreciate you considering that. And if you think in any way that shortchanges you, it's just a suggestion, not a requirement.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, then, at this time, it appears appropriate that we adjourn for today and then reconvene at 9 a.m. on June 11th in this very hearing room. Okay. Thank you for your participation today.
Thank you.